Welcome to Radio Abundance, a podcast by YIMBY Democrats for America. It's time to build again, folks. Fascism never made America great, but when progressives build, that's where you'll find American greatness. Tonight's first guest is United States Congresswoman Laura Friedman. A one-time Hollywood film producer and mayor, Congresswoman Friedman fought against parking minimums in the California State Assembly. Now she fights for abundance in the U.S. Congress. He'll be followed by a trio of amazing women and lawmakers from Arizona. Arizona State Senator Analise Ortiz, Arizona State Representative Sarah Ligouri, and Phoenix City Councilmember Anna Hernandez. Together, they're like the three musketeers of abundance in Arizona. Tonight's special episode features two amazing interviews with four trailblazing women. And what trail are they blazing? Why, it's the path forward to American progressive abundance.
You're listening to Radio Abundance, a podcast by YIMBY Democrats for America. Now let's get to the show.
Please welcome your host for the evening, YIMBY Democrats for America Executive Director Steve Boyle. And to kick things off, here's Steve.
I'm Donald J. Trump, and I hate these guys.
Hello, and welcome to Radio Abundance. I'm Steve Boyle, here as always with the Armand Domalewski. Later, you will also hear from Burhan Azim and Elizabeth Markowitz. We have a double feature today with two amazing interviews. First, we talk with United States Congresswoman Laura Friedman, and then we sit down with a trio of Arizona state lawmakers, Analise Ortiz, Sarah Ligouri, and Anna Hernandez. First, we're going to reflect on two amazing events we did in the past week and a half in San Francisco and for the New York City mayoral race. But before that, let's bring in Armand. Hey, Armand, how you doing?
Hi, I'm doing great. We had some great events, and I feel like I'm still cleaning off the energy and the intensity of that, but been great.
It is definitely post-show mode with two shows in the past 10 days. So I think we are both excited and exhausted. We are indeed back from a 2-week hiatus because of those two big events. So first, in San Francisco, we brought together 10 groups from the Abundance, YIMBY, and Democratic ecosystem, from Inclusive Abundance to YIMBY Action and SF YIMBY, to Abundance Network and the Bay Area Liberals from the Center for New Liberalism, all the way to the San Francisco Democratic Party, which is a remarkable turnaround, which would have been unfathomable a year ago. We also had the United Democratic Club, the Breakthrough Institute, and the Housing Action Coalition. And we all got together and threw a big happy hour party inspired by and supported by Inclusive Abundance and Derek Kaufman. We also got some amazing support from the Center for New Liberalism and Bay Area New Liberals. All 10 of those orgs went to the mat to build a culture of abundance, right? Where we all can thrive, supporting and growing each other. How are we going to bring abundance to America if we can't build it amongst ourselves? And so that was a huge success. We also held a live podcast taping for Radio Abundance, which folks from a lot of those different groups, which we are very excited to share with you in the next few weeks. And, you know, unbelievably, we planned this in about 2 weeks and had about 250 people there. So it was incredible fun. And Armand even got in a killer Andor quote that made it to the papers.
I've confirmed to the public now that I'm a gigantic nerd, but yeah, so Mission Local, which is one of the San Francisco's local news outlets, I'm very grateful that they covered us, and they quoted me saying, "We are in a war of fascism." As Andor reminded me, either you want to fight or you want to win, and people in this room, we want to fucking win. And that really summarizes how I feel about it, which is that I think a lot of politics is there's people who love to fight and express themselves and have their opinions said. And that's okay. Like, it's good to get those feelings out. But at the end of the day, what matters to me and what matters to the people in that room is that this is a fight against fascism and a fight to build America that we want to win.
Yeah, I thought that article and some of the press around it was sort of incredible in the sense that when you think of, to me, tell me if you agree, Armand, you know, a lot of the local press in San Francisco tends to maybe lean a little NIMBY, if not sometimes more overtly so. And so to have a local press from the Mission come out to our event in the Mission and say three things about the event. They said, we are mobilizing to defeat fascism. They said we're motivated by what they called moving stories that we all told, and you can look forward to hearing about moving stories from our lives and from the people we've met who suffer under high rents and that we want to look out for. And finally, that we're here to rally people together to support every org, to recruit their friends. To me, that is a kind of a best case scenario for local press in San Francisco.
I mean, everyone thinks that the press is biased against them and is like too nice to their opponents. And so I'm aware I have that in my head too. But I think local press by its nature tends to have a local perspective. And so it was really nice to see local press be willing to sort of see our perspective about how this broader vision supports everybody.
A ton of people worked very hard in 2 weeks to make something very special happen. And a ton of people came and we had a amazing and special time together. And we're so grateful for everyone that worked so hard. Everybody that came, it's all about showing up, and everybody we got to meet. And just as a new org, so honored by these 9 partners and friends from different corners of the scene that came out to support and be a part of this.
Yeah, I particularly appreciated that we had sort of people from across the broad spectrum of abundance. This is a very intentional goal of mine, is to say, let's not just bring in together the housing group. So we had California YIMBY Action, the Housing Action Coalition, but then let's bring in people focused on clean energy, like the Breakthrough Institute. And then let's bring in people who are focused on abundance broadly, like the Abundance Network, which does work supporting elected officials across the country for abundance. And then also to emphasize like democratic groups locally already like pro-abundance, like the United Democratic Club, the San Francisco Democratic Party, which is really big. And then to sort of top it all off with sort of the main supporter of this event, Inclusive Abundance, which has been doing this work federally. And they do stuff like science research and innovation research on top of everything else. And that's something actually I saw in the press coverage made me really happy, is that I think it'd be easy for the press to sort of slot this into another like EMB's housing thing, which it is, but like they're explicit about like, we want more housing, we want more transit, we want more clean energy. And I think that's like why we needed this happy hour, is that we needed an abundance happy hour to bring together all the different ideas that go into abundance.
Well, speaking of inclusive abundance, I nearly forgot something huge, which is that Jared Kaufman and our friends at Inclusive Abundance were a huge part of rallying together and launching the newly announced Congressional Build America Caucus. And given that our missions are to build America and defeat fascism, we could not be more excited that something's in the water. And, we sat down with Congressman Scott Peters, and he told us that the work on YIMBYs for Harris was a huge part in the direct inspiration for making the Congressional YIMBY Caucus happen. We had nothing to do with making the Build America Caucus happen, but could not be more excited that one of our 2 missions has, about 6 weeks after we launched, has a bipartisan congressional caucus sharing the same name. It's very exciting.
And that's part of why we did the event, is to highlight like groups already working together, right? Like these coalitions are happening. You're seeing aspects of it out there where like Derek's helping build this Build America Caucus, like all the housing groups are coordinating. But this was an opportunity to sort of celebrate their work together. And while there's certainly other public outlets of it, we wanted to add that and have like a big party and be like, look at these great groups doing great work together. I think in a way that surfacing that and highlighting that to the public was really valuable.
Yeah, so thank you to all of our unbelievable producing partners, not only for teaming up with us on this, but for welcoming us to the scene, to the abundance scene, to the YIMBY scene, to the Democratic Party scene. We are honored to join you and honored to fight with you. And speaking of folks we're honored to fight with, we did a second event in collaboration with Zellner Myrie and his campaign for the mayor to become the mayor of New York City. We are super inspired by his campaign, and especially his Rebuild NYC plan, which will build 700,000 new homes, preserve and improve 300,000 new homes, for a total of 1 million new homes in New York City in the next 10 years. He has an amazing story. He grew up working class in Brooklyn, the son of Costa Rican immigrants. He fought his whole life for tenants. He defended renters in court from horrible conditions. And he's really lived the New York dream and could not be a nicer guy. So can't do it alone. And we didn't just team up with the Zellner Myrie campaign and some awesome folks there. We also teamed up with Abundance New York PAC and the New York New Liberals, the New York City New Liberals, part of the Center for New Liberalism. We all got together for a virtual event. Zellner took us through his plans and took questions from the audience. And once again, it was exciting to be there to tell their story with them, to host people and get people direct access to the candidate and folks in New York City and from across the country a chance to share their questions and hear what Zellner had to say. So it was very exciting and exciting to do it with that. Exciting to do that with you, Armand. What'd you think?
Well, so I want to be a little bit blunt here, which is that, like, look, we fully understand, and Zellner's campaign understands, like, nobody's naive about the state of the polling. And so the reason I want to speak to people directly about this is to understand that, one, things could change very, very quickly, very, very soon, because a lot of people are just starting to pay attention. If you look at previous New York mayoral races, like Eric Adams was nowhere near contention until very late in the race. Andrew Yang was supposed to be the mayor for a while in that race. Scott Stringer, like, a lot can still happen, and a few high-profile things and endorsements can change things. But I think regardless of that, what Zellner represents to me is a shift in the conversation. Every other mayoral candidate, to be like really blunt, to me represents a lot of like similar and same arguments, and not a lot of like really big picture thinking about the challenges that the biggest city in America faces. There's a sort of idea, like, yeah, I'm not going to reference anyone specifically, but, there's people who have a lot of ideas and smaller concepts and whatever, but like Zellner has a very specific, very direct plan to build an enormous amount of units. And while that sounds like a big number and sounds scary, New York City is the biggest city in America. It has like 8 million people. And the fact that nobody else is talking about a level of housing construction that New York City used to routinely see, it's crazy. And I'd also add there's no better messenger. Like, Zellner's a great guy. Like, he's just so nice. He's so smart. He's so thoughtful. Big fan of the podcast. So obviously, that's number one. It was a real honor to be on there with him, to talk to him. And I know that I really, really would like him to win this race. But I also know that if he doesn't, this is just a beginning and not an end for him. He's going to have a big influence in politics going forward. And the better he can do, the more important his ideas will be for New York City and for America. So I strongly urge folks like to donate, to support him, to volunteer. I know that things can seem daunting and difficult, but even a loss in this race, if he comes closer, that will be important and that will matter. And showing the support for that is in of itself really important.
Yeah, for all of the YIMBY versus DSA drama on Twitter, it's worth calling out Zellner Myrie and Zoran Mondani are friends, good friends. They talk all the time and are supportive of each other, even as they both run for the mayor of New York City. Zellner might not agree with this comment because he'd like to win, and we'd like him to win. But there's also definitely a way in which I think we can look at his campaign today and say it's already had some pretty significant successes. Like Armand talked about, in terms of shifting the narrative and pushing the other candidates to all release a housing plan. And even folks who are bent against it, or maybe were a couple years ago, are talking about building housing. And that's really exciting. Zellner is the living embodiment that building more public housing, building more market rate housing, and taking care of renters are 3 very compatible ideas that fit well together. And Zellner does something else that really excites me. He talks a lot, I think, about what I might call the spirit of New York and recapturing that, right? So the greatest example he uses, we love it too, is the Empire State Building was built in 13 months at the height of the Great Depression. Armand, off the top of your head, how long has it been since California uh, decided to build high-speed rail?
Well, I don't want to think about that because it makes me feel very old. Like Obama's funding for it, which was not the beginning of that planning, was in 2009, and we're in 2025. So I will leave that math as an exercise to the reader.
Yeah, quick math, 16 years, and there's a little bit of track built,
God.
and it is not functional.
If
So,
I'd had a child then, they would be almost graduating high school. So
the Empire State Building, built in 13 months at the height of the Great Depression, it also changed the neighborhood character. It is about 5 times as tall as any of the neighboring buildings at that time, and it changed the city and is one of the most iconic landmarks in all of America and all of the world. As Zellner likes to say, come on, this is New York City. We can do big things. That's the dream. It's what makes people so excited to live there, so excited to visit there. New York City must continue to lead America, and housing and building and creation and reaching for the skies is a great way for New York City to do that.
well, speaking of podcast guests, Zellner was a great one. We've got some great ones coming up today. First, we're going to have Laura Friedman, the Congresswoman who used to represent the Los Angeles area in the Assembly, was recently elected to Congress, has been a long-standing EV champion. It was really fun to talk to her. She's super smart, very funny, has apparently you'll learn some movie trivia in this conversation. She used to be a film producer. And then we'll be speaking with 3 lawmakers from Arizona, Senator Analise Ortiz, Representative Sarah Ligouri, and City Councilwoman Anna Hernandez. So Sarah Ligouri, representative, actually was with us from the beginning for EMBs for Harris. She got into WhatsApp. I do remember specifically like this person named Sarah being like, oh, I can help you with this. Let's try to do this. And I was like, wow, the Sarah person's so nice. She's like so helpful. And casually I figured out she was like an elected official writing good housing laws and fighting for housing laws. And she introduced us to then Senator Hernandez, who's now on the city council, and Senator Ortiz. And they're really sort of like the tip of the spear champions for building housing in Arizona. And while Arizona is considered, I think in housing conversations often like, oh, the cheap, affordable place that people leave the Bay Area for, the truth is that as it's grown really fast, that is no longer true. And they're really trying to change the political culture so that there can be not only housing built, but housing built in a smart, thoughtful, dense, walkable way that is good for the environment and good for affordability. And it just, as a YIMBY who started in the Bay Area, it's like really exciting to be like, oh, wow, we just did an event, somebody from New York. Now we're going to speak to like a congresswoman from Los Angeles and then elected officials from Arizona. It speaks to like the depth and the breadth of this movement. And yeah, I can't be more excited for y'all to hear from them.
Honestly, it's a really special episode, I think. Senator Ortiz, Representative Ligouri, Councilmember Hernandez, we all sat down together. They are friends. They are so fun together. And it was really cool to dig a little bit into not just their perspectives and work in Arizona, but how they work together, how they get stuff done and support each other. It's a really fun and interesting conversation. We also did get to ask some really interesting questions around gender and race and how that informs their experiences and their goals and the communities they serve and how we bring in everybody's perspectives and lift everybody up. So that was a really special conversation, I thought, that I was honored that we were able to have with them. And then U.S. Congresswoman Laura Friedman, as Armand said, a Hollywood film producer turned council member, turned mayor of Glendale, California, who served in the California State Assembly, now represents California's 30th district in the United States Congress. She was aggressive in Los Angeles at taking on parking, which is amazing and courageous. As somebody from the entertainment and arts industry myself, it was really exciting to get to ask her about her Hollywood roots and the role of storytelling in both policy and politics. So two really exciting conversations. Armand, what else should folks know before we get to it?
I really appreciate that Councilmember Hernandez talked about how she actually came into housing activism by first being focused on police reform and fighting against police brutality and criminal justice issues. And she saw housing as sort of an extension of that work around justice and economic justice. I think for, a lot of people perceive housing as this sort of like centrist, whatever, neoliberal, blah, blah, blah thing, which, part of the mission of this podcast is to really push against that. We believe that being progressive means being pro-housing. And so it's really cool to see someone who, I think people who are critics would often see like a Latino woman who's a police reform activist and be very surprised that that person is a YIMBY. While for us, it's like, makes total sense and is like very natural. And so I really loved hearing her perspective on that. And yeah, Congresswoman Friedman, I think it was very funny, just like, and she's aware of like how ironic it seems for like a Los Angeles elected official to be known as like introducing reforms of parking mandates, but sort of like a only Nixon can go to China sort of thing, right? Like this is someone who like really understands how much Angelinos like love their cars and are reliant on their cars, and could still communicate about how if we reduce mandates for parking, people can have more affordable homes and people can make choices about whether they want to live with a car or have fewer cars or do car share. And so like understanding that perspective, I think was really great, and really, again, excited for y'all to hear from you.
It's a special episode, 2 interviews, 4 guests. We swear to you that we will move away from the double feature format soon, but people want to talk to us, and that's a great problem to have. And these conversations were awesome. So for this week, we still have an embarrassment of riches, an abundance of awesome lawmakers. And let's get to our first one right now, and our interview with United States Congresswoman Laura Friedman. New York City embodies America. Ambitious, optimistic, relentlessly reaching for new heights. The city's been a meeting ground for culture, commerce, and creation since the days of New Amsterdam, and led in the American Revolution, becoming the first capital of the United States. The Statue of Liberty gave our nation a symbol, a personification of the spirit of America. At the height of the Great Depression, New York City rose to lead our comeback, symbolized by the Empire State Building. Even as a resident of New York City, FDR rose to lead and save the nation with a fierce progressive spirit and progressive ambitions. His era saw new public construction, like the Hoover Dam and the Golden Gate Bridge, as America defeated fascism across Europe and Asia. Robert Moses started taking on massive projects to develop the city, but this veered into destruction, trashing public life and cultural communities to create concrete highways. So the gears of change came to an abrupt halt. Buildings stopped and rents began to rise as public decision-making and infrastructure creation stalled and the city fell into disrepair, crime, and chaos. When the city was so thwarted that it could not even build a public ice skating rink in Central Park, a wealthy scion and tycoon stepped up to fund and corral the skating rink's reinvention, pushing the illusion that while governments could not serve their people, he could. That man's name was Donald Trump. As Donald Trump failed upwards, enrapturing the city and the world in a cult of personality that marketed him as a genius even as his businesses crumbled, Costa Rican immigrants in Brooklyn gave birth to a child, Zellner Myrie. Zellner grew up working class. He was educated in New York's public schools and worked his way up to become a lawyer at a prestigious firm. But Zellner Myrie never forgot his roots. He advocated for poor tenants against horrendous living conditions in court. He passed the strongest tenant rights legislation in a generation. He fought to ban evictions when plague hit New York City during the COVID-19 pandemic. And in Albany, Zellner wrote the nation's first gun industry liability law, passed the strongest voting rights bill in the country, blocked the planned closure of New York City's only state-run hospital, and won critical state funding for after-school programs. Today, Donald Trump has taken control of America. He is enacting a campaign of lawlessness and cruelty to solidify his rule, destroy America's values, intimidate opposition and free speech, entrench his political power, and devastate the American economy in a negative-sum game. From amidst the darkness, Zellner Myrie has a plan for a revival. It's about more than just New York City. It's about New York City being a model for this nation, an aspiring vision for how America can rise again, how we can reach again, how we can lift up all of us in a world of positive sums where we all rise together. Zellner's vision is a model that Americans caught in tragic hopelessness from coast to coast and sea to shining sea can look to for hope, a vision for the future, a path forward, and a reason to believe in Democrats, not only as the alternative to Trump, but as the true vessel for a renewed American greatness. Zellner's plan will recapture and reinvigorate the spirit of New York as New York City rises like a phoenix to ascend to its greatest heights yet. With 1 million new homes built and preserved in 10 years, with after school for all and safe streets and subways, no one will be left behind. Zellner has a plan to protect tenants, build abundant public housing for the least fortunate, and unleash housing construction everywhere to lift everyone up. It is a vision of progressive greatness, of ambition and creation, of progressives who build and progressives who get stuff done. Today, we gather for the man with the plan, Zellner Myrie.
That was from a little video we whipped up for Zellner Myrie. We hope you enjoyed it. Now, back to the show. Tonight's first guest is United States Congresswoman Laura Friedman. A one-time Hollywood film producer and mayor, Congresswoman Friedman fought against parking minimums in the California State Assembly. Now, she fights for abundance in the U.S. Congress. Please welcome to Radio Abundance, United States Congresswoman Laura Friedman. And to kick things off, here's your host, Steve Boyle.
Representative Friedman, thank you so much for joining us on Radio Abundance.
Thanks for inviting me. It's exciting to be here with you.
We're excited to have you. We're super excited to talk about your background, your work in California, your work in Congress, even your background in the film industry is really interesting to us, and we're excited to talk about that and all things storytelling. And hey, for everybody who might not be familiar with you yet, I'm wondering if you can introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about who you are and what you're working on these days in Congress.
Great. So I'm Laura Friedman, and I represent the 30th District in California, which is parts of Los Angeles, namely the Hollywood area and the Tri-Hipster area as well of Silver Lake, Echo Park, and Los Feliz, and then the cities of Glendale, Burbank, West Hollywood, and a little bit of Pasadena. So it's a fabulous district. It's very vibrant. But it's also a district that for years increasingly has been housing poor. And the crisis over the lack of California's ability or desire to build enough housing to accommodate its residents has reached a really epic proportions in Los Angeles. And we see homelessness everywhere. And we also have overcrowding. And we certainly have people who the idea of ever owning a home seems completely out of reach. And lots of our residents are struggling with rents that are, sometimes half of their take-home salary. So it's the reason why I've spent, my last 8 years in the California Legislature focusing on issues around housing production, as well as issues around public transportation and the environment, because I actually think that these are very connected issues that need to be de-siloed. And so I've spent a lot of my career trying to make people understand that environmental policy is also housing policy, is also something that we're not going to fix without transportation policy.
Something I find really fascinating in your background actually is that, you're a representative from California, it's just like Los Angeles, but you authored a lot of great bills to reduce parking mandates. And, usually when I think Los Angeles, and I have a lot of family and friends out there, reducing the amount of parking does not sound like the most popular thing out there. I'm curious, sort of like, what was your journey to recognizing that like bills like AB 1401, AB 2097, those efforts to reduce parking mandates were necessary? And how did you sort of build the political support to accomplish that in an area that's not traditionally seen as very friendly to sort of parking reduction?
That's a great question. It's one of my favorite things to talk about. So I think that I was considered to be the only Los Angeles-based YIMBY, for lack of a better term, while I was in the legislature. And it has been a really hard discussion in Los Angeles for a variety of reasons that we don't even have the time to start getting into. But for one thing, as an elected representative, I represent everybody in my community and even around the community as far as I'm concerned, because we make laws in Congress for the whole country, not just for the 30th district. And I made laws in California for the whole state. And I had to think about not just the single family homeowners who didn't need parking as a problem and wanted to be able to park wherever they went, but the people who didn't have a place to live or didn't have an adequate place to live or couldn't afford where they were living. And it became very clear to me that there were barriers to building the housing that we need. And when you look and coming from local government, because I was a council member for 8 years and mayor of the city of Glendale, in local government, land use is kind of your bread and butter. What you mostly do in local government is think about how you're going to develop and grow as a community, how people live, and it's very immediate on the ground kind of issues that we deal with. And we have dedicated an incredible amount of precious land and space in Los Angeles and around the country to parking. So an economist named Donald Shoup, who was, I think, at UCLA, wrote a book about the high price of parking. And he talked about how what we think of as being free is actually not free, and that we all pay for this very inefficient use of land. And what I tell people is, we dedicate more space for every car in California than we do for places for people to live. If you think about that we have prioritized parking cars to where we have multiple spaces available at all times for every single of the millions of cars in California, but we don't have a place for everyone to live. We dedicate more space. I had the statistic. It was something like we have 1,000 square feet of space for every car, but only 800 square feet of space for every person for housing. So we've got that all backwards. And we also invest millions, billions of dollars in mass transit in California. And yet we have not given that transit a really fair chance to work, because if you put a lot of parking near transit, surprise, surprise, people will just drive their cars to whatever those locations are. But if you tell people like, hey, it's going to be really inconvenient for you to try to park, but we have this really nice train and we're going to give you a park and ride somewhere else, and you can take the train into this very congested area, like let's say downtown LA and LA Live, people will use they'll use transit. And so you give transit a chance to actually work, and you also give people a chance to pay less money to live in an apartment that doesn't have a parking space. And the bottom line, we spoke to a lot of residents who were living in places in San Diego, for instance, which already had a similar ordinance in their downtown, where they were able to afford a really nice apartment in downtown San Diego because they weren't paying for a parking space that they weren't using. That they instead were using transit and riding their bike around and walking to work. And so they were like, why do I have to pay for a parking space? So there were all kinds of reasons. And I would say that, as someone who I'm very much an environmentalist, and what keeps me awake at night more than anything else is climate change and loss of biodiversity. Having people live in a more condensed area where they can get around using transit and walking and biking, and where they can get more quickly and easily to where they work, is an environmental imperative, because the alternative to that is sprawl. It's sprawl, and losing habitat, losing farmland, and also having people using cars, which are still by and large fossil fuel powered. So there's a real environmental imperative to find better ways for people to move around. And all you have to do is go to pretty much any major European city to see how they have figured this out and not sacrifice their quality of life. They have a better quality of life. So it's all about living better, making things more affordable, being more sustainable, and, making sure that people can actually afford where they're living, and have a better choices. And we just haven't offered enough of that in California.
Speaking of the shift from sprawl to infill, 2020 authored a bill for CEQA exemptions for infill housing. It was held in committee. And this year, Assemblymember Bucky Wicks has legislation, I believe it's AB 607, CEQA exemptions for infill housing. Well, I'm curious, or have you worked with her on that legislation? Because it very seems like a successor to your bill.
Yeah.
And also, do you think, how politics changed so that the idea you had, which I wish had passed then, but like now finally the politics seem to have shifted that it's looking more likely to pass.
Sometimes it takes a while to normalize these big ideas. So
Yeah.
I did the parking reform bill, and it took me a couple of years to do that. But Nancy Skinner, who was a state senator, had introduced a similar bill several years earlier. It just wasn't the right time. But you have to have someone who starts the conversation. So when I was chair of natural resources, I introduced this bill 2020, and that bill would have been a categorical exemption from CEQA, from the California Environmental Quality Act, for all infill housing. And I thought it was a great bill because we know that it's much more sustainable to build the housing that we need in an already developed infill area. And by the way, the bill didn't change zoning. It wasn't going to like upend and destroy people's neighborhoods or anything like that. It was literally saying, if you're building an apartment building on what used to be a Winchell's donut shop, why should you have to go through a lengthy environmental review when we know that that apartment building is going to do nothing bad to the environment and only good things, reduce emissions, and also give people a place to live, which we desperately need. So why should you bog this down with a couple of years of environmental review when we know the answer is that it's going to be environmentally beneficial? So it made all the sense in the world to me then, and it makes sense to me now. And Bucky is a good friend and been a great partner of mine on a lot of my legislation. And I wish her well on the successor to my legislation, and I will take a victory lap when it passes.
I'm actually, I'll let these guys go. Other questions soon, I promise. One thing I think is sort of interesting for us and for our listeners is that, we talk about like these ideas, abundance, and we read articles, but the black box of how like ideas work through the legislature and how legislators change their minds, I think is really mysterious for most people. Like when you talked about like, you normalize the idea, what happens between like those years, like when Nancy Skinner introduced it, right? And then you introduce one version, another version. Is it that like legislators just like read more, talk to you and change their minds over time? Is it that like groups change their minds over time? Is that polling change? Like, I'm curious as to actually how it works on the ground level of like how ideas shifts in the legislature.
Yeah, that's a great question too. I would say with parking, I think when Nancy first introduced it, I would say that the sort of pro-housing movement was smaller. And it was not as much in the zeitgeist, and the crisis wasn't as bad. Let's be honest. The crisis was really bad in San Francisco, but hadn't spread across California the way that it did later. And we saw rents and housing prices really skyrocket very, very quickly. When I first moved to Los Angeles in 1992, I found my apartment because you could just drive up and down the streets of Hollywood and there were just for rent signs everywhere and you would just call them. And even me as coming in as a, sort of entry level film person, not a huge income, not a big shot. I could rent a decent apartment in Hollywood and not have it break the bank. That is not the case any longer. So, we saw a really big change. And so it could be that when Nancy first introduced the bill, there just wasn't as much of a crisis that she was addressing. And that means that there maybe weren't as many advocates behind it. And having people who are grassroots advocates across the state, or, in my case now across the country, pushing other representatives to support something is key to getting big and difficult ideas through. The way that I also normalized the bill was I tried to make it as bipartisan as I could. And I spoke to Republicans. I just said, hey, why should the nanny state tell a private property owner how much parking they need for their development? Shouldn't they be able to make that decision themselves without the nanny state looking over their shoulder? And a lot of Republicans said, this is a property rights bill and I'm going to support it. And they did. And that helped quite a bit that we had bipartisan support on that bill. It's funny, if you looked at the vote and the discussion, you probably couldn't have told who was a Democrat and who was a Republican when we were having our debates about the legislation. There were Democrats who loved it. There were Democrats who hated it. There were Republicans who loved it, and there were Republicans who hated it because, some things like the cost of housing really shouldn't be a partisan issue.
On that note, right, one of the through lines of the conversation so far has been how do we achieve core progressive goals, right? Here we believe that every human being has dignity. They deserve a home and a roof over their heads. That means having enough homes for everybody. You pointed out, in a way, our cities are filled with free and abundant public housing. It's just public housing for parked cars, not people. We know that, we believe that climate change is a cataclysmic threat, and yet there are, it can be difficult to build climate infrastructure, and so California is getting lapped in some ways by Texas.
Yeah, I did legislation around that too. I did a bill that would have streamlined and had a Caterpillar exemption for building substations to handle electrical load as we add more electricity onto the grid, more clean energy, so that we could deal with electricity coming in from new solar and new wind. And I couldn't get that goal through the legislature either, which is crazy to me because, all this process, process is good if it's making sure that we're not doing bad things to people, to vulnerable people, right? Then you really need the process. You want to make sure that we're not doing a polluting factory in an economically disadvantaged community. We absolutely need people to be able to weigh in on things like that and what happens to their community and get the buy-in, make projects better. But what we don't need is so much process that we stop projects that have the ability to save our planet. I mean, there's a certain point where you have to say, maybe we should sit down and figure out and come to an agreement about the times when the process is not going to be additive. And when we know that this thing that is being done, this thing we're building is demonstratively good for the environment and good for human beings, even though there may be people who don't think it, that the good that it does is so important that it outweighs the fact that we are using process in a way that's just stopping things. It doesn't make sense to me. And it's very frustrating to me as someone who is progressive, lies awake at night, worried about climate change, and has constituents who can't pay their rent, right? We can't just, so look, get back for a second to parking reform. When I did parking reform, people thought that I was absolutely insane. And there are people who would say, you are doing this thing that is really disruptive and really massive. And, maybe I don't like it. I don't like it. And what I would say back is, I get that. I'm going to do bills year after year that are going to be really big and that swing for the stars and that a lot of people aren't going to like, because you know what? Sitting around and trying to find the perfect solution is what got us into this mess. And if we don't do anything, we're not acknowledging the gravity of the problems that people are facing. So you can either try to really address them and run the risk of doing the wrong thing every now and then. And you know what? If we do something and it's really bad, we still have a legislature. We still have Congress. We can go back and fix it. But if we don't do anything and we let problems get so bad that we just can't address them anymore because they're so massive, we miss the chance to head off a disaster. So I have no problem with going and doing something that is big and bold. And you're right. Sometimes I did a bill about automated speed enforcement for egregious speeding. It took me 4 years to get that passed, which in Congress, is nothing. But in the California Legislature, where you only get 12 years, that's a lot. That's a lot. And it was the first time we introduced the bill, people across the state had so many problems with it. They remembered the red light camera program. They didn't want to do that again for those who are in California. So you know what we did? We sat down with all the opponents, including AAA. And we said, we have a problem. We're seeing 30% increases of fatal collisions for pedestrians and cyclists year after year. Not safe to walk down the street. Kids are getting killed. My daughter, who's now going to be 12, I'm scared to let her just walk to school, right? This is a real problem. So we get that there's all of these considerations about this bill and things people don't like. So let's list them and let's address them. And we ended up addressing everything: equity, disadvantaged communities, being unfair, concerns about privacy, about these problems being cash cows. And we wrote what is undeniably the best bill about automated enforcement that exists in the United States, and a bill that deals with every single one of these concerns. That was so good that we had groups from Black and brown communities standing up and saying, we desperately need this, and this addresses our concerns. We had AAA come on as a supporter of the legislation. They had never done that before, the automated enforcement. We had support from every single corner of the state of California because we took people's concerns seriously, and we did everything we could to address them. It's not to say that everybody ended up supporting it, but we built such a big tent that after 4 years of trying, we got that legislation passed. And I'm really, really proud of it. So, you just have to, you can't mock the opposition. You have to actually listen to them because a lot of times people have real concerns. And if you can address them, you address them, but you should never let that process stop you from trying. You may have to fix it later, but we don't have time to sit around and not try.
Speaking of opposition, you mentioned alleged AB 914 for the electrical substations. I'm curious sort of who opposed that and why, because it seems like a no-brainer to me that like we really need to build a lot more clean energy and require, people to use electric cars. There's a lot more demand for it. Like you need the infrastructure to build it.
There were people in the legislature who just didn't feel that CEQA, which the bill targeted, presented a big barrier to building these substations. But we were hearing from the utilities that they were adding 1 to 2 years of delay at least and making the projects a lot more expensive. And to me, it doesn't make sense why, because a lot of the substation are rebuilt. So you already have an existing substation. So you've got this thing filled with wires. And when you rebuild it, in a lot of cases, you're making it smaller because you're taking older and inefficient hardware and replacing it with newer hardware that tends to have a smaller footprint. So it didn't make a lot of sense to me. It's not like we're not talking about going into a beautiful, pristine meadow filled with rare wildflowers and endangered species and then knocking it all down to build something new. For the most part, you're talking about replacing something that already exists with something that's cleaner and smaller and nicer looking. So I don't understand why we have to put this through a long environmental process. So I can't say that I completely understand the opposition that we had, but we had enough of it that we couldn't get the bill heard in committee. And I do believe that the governor did work on this and that people are still continuing to work on these issues because we need to streamline transmission and all of the clean energy infrastructure. We just don't have time. The climate is changing too quickly. Electrical rates are too high for people. This would help bring down rates for ratepayers and clean up our grid. And we don't want to have to keep burning fossil fuel in California unnecessarily.
Elizabeth, so I certainly want to get in some questions about your film background and hopefully even the responding to the recent fires. But I want to make sure, Elizabeth, to see if any burning questions on your mind.
Well, yeah, actually, speaking about the wildfires, you spoke about climate change being something that keeps you up at night. And I think that's becoming so much more real to so many Americans as we're seeing natural disasters have real impacts on people's lives, losing their homes and, everything they've built up. And, obviously California is recovering from devastating wildfires. And so I just wanted to hear how, kind of what you've been doing around that and the legislation that you've introduced, and also how you think recovery from natural disasters kind of coincide with the pro-housing movement.
Sure. So we've done some bills to look at FEMA and some of the processes that FEMA has built in, kind of baked into their process that are unfair to people, particularly around people who have GoFundMe pages and who maybe they raise money or their church or their synagogue or their friend raise money for them. In some cases, FEMA sees that as income and actually will say that they're going to reduce the amount you would get by that amount. So in that case, people aren't raising money for the victim; they're raising money for FEMA, and it doesn't make sense. So this is a bill that I've introduced to stop that practice. It's bipartisan, and I've got some hopes that will help get more money into victims' pockets. We're also working on a bill about price gouging nationwide after natural disasters, so that when there's a declared presidential natural disaster, we have some price control, so that on the worst day of their life, we don't see people ripped off by unscrupulous businesses. And then lastly, and this touches a little bit more of your arena around housing. One of the questions that we face after these natural disasters, whether it's from wildfire, and we had this discussion after Paradise and that awful, awful fire that killed so many people, they have these discussions in areas that are prone to flooding over and over again, is at what point should we try to encourage people to move to somewhere that is safer. Now, I'm not advocating that the government stops anyone from building on their property. I don't think anybody would advocate for that. But in many cases, particularly when it comes to wildfire, the people who rebuild are not going to be able to buy insurance. It's going to be very expensive for them to rebuild in these areas, to make their home resilient, and they're not going to get insurance at the end of it, or they'll be on Fair Plan, which I'm on myself, and they may not get a good night's sleep when the wind's blowing. Paradise burned several times before this last fire. And some of, when you have areas that we know are going to continue because of climate change to just be dangerous places to live, shouldn't we also give people options? So we have introduced a bill that takes existing program that exists for flood, that it says if you're in a place that we know is going to continue to flood and you lose your home in a flooding event, FEMA will come in and buy your property for market value from before it was destroyed so that you have a chance to go and move somewhere else safer. So you don't have to go through this over and over again. So we have a bill that will study whether that program can be extended to areas that are destroyed by wildfire, which makes sense to me. It would be totally voluntary for the homeowner. They can rebuild if they want, but if they say, hey, as so many people are saying to me, I'm 75, 80 years old. By the time this home is built, it's not going to do anything for me. I'd rather have the money right now where I can go and move into a condo now or move somewhere else. Right now, people don't always have that option. This will give them that option.
As promised, I would love now to ask about your Hollywood background. I'll share that, my background is also in the entertainment industry, so I was really excited to learn more about that. I want to learn more about your origin story and also how you're using it today. I'll say that it seems to me like quite a lot of politics really does come down to storytelling, and it's also not lost on me. I think, Ronald Reagan was an actor, and I think that's a lot of how he approached his presidency. Donald Trump was a reality TV show executive producer. And so I think it's not surprising that he approaches his presidency, I would say, a lot by kind of inventing his own versions of reality and making us all compete in them.
He invented his background, and his acumen was a creation of a reality show. Yeah.
It's a myth. It's a TV character, and now we live in that.
Right.
So I'm curious.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm curious background and what you've learned and how you're applying it today.
Thanks. And you're right that storytelling and communicating is a big part of what politicians do. That communication is really, really important. I also think it's important that you are able to have a vision. And to me, a lot of making entertainment, a lot of making film and TV, which was what I did, has to do with having a vision and holding that vision in your mind and being able to communicate that with other people and then working with them to hold the vision. Because as you know, if you're working on a film, you may read a book and you have an idea, but when you bring in the other creative people, when the director comes in, the writers, the set designers, they bring their own vision to that project. And to me, doing a bill is so similar. People may come in and they pitch their idea. I've got this idea for a bill, or you see a need somewhere and you come up with that vision, and then you get your stakeholders together. You build your crew and your cast, right? And then everybody gives their input, and maybe you change your vision, you own it based on their input and that whole universe of different experiences that they bring to the table. And then you have to go out and communicate that to the public and get them on board. And that means that they have to share the vision, right? Of what, in my case with housing legislation, it's the vision of what we could have, right? And a better city that we could have if we just change our policies and have a united vision about a place where we do have abundance and where we have enough housing for everybody and we have public transportation so that we get cars off the road and we're not all just sitting stuck in traffic all the time. Like, we know what that looks like because there's other cities that have done that and other people that live that way. So we want that for our residents too. We want that affordability where people can afford now to pay their rent because there's enough units out there to bring the rents down. And like, they had the experience I had when I came to LA, where you have all this choice. Do I want to live here? Do I want to live there? There's for rent signs all over the place and I can afford to live there. And now maybe I can just jump on public transportation to get around instead of having to spend all this money on a car or I can take an Uber or whatever. So we know what the vision is. It's just about now figuring out how to get there. So my origin story, as you said, is I I grew up in South Florida and I loved science fiction. I grew up reading science fiction. I still do. So I thought that I wanted to like be an astrophysicist, right? Because of course, like I'm always looking at the stars and I'm reading about space. So I'm going to go and study astrophysics. I didn't really think that having failed algebra and getting like a D in high school physics, like didn't really clue me in, but I somehow get into this college that has University of Rochester that has an astrophysics department. So I go to my first day of math. The professor is like, all right, here's all this stuff you all learned in high school. And he's writing equations on this board. And I look at it and I just went, I don't understand any of this. I didn't learn in high school. Well, I can't do this. That's not how I'm built. I got up and I walked out and I ended up studying film instead. And I realized that all the time it was actually the fiction part of the science fiction I liked. It wasn't the science part. And so I studied film.
You did end up looking at a lot of stars.
I looked at, that's right. Very good.
You grew up at Glendale, where Disney and Star Wars are made.
That's right. So I didn't know. Listen, I've seen Gravity, so I don't want to go to space. Like, I always say to people, I've watched all these movies. It always goes wrong. I mean, whether it's your regular Ford or 2001: Space Odyssey, like it's not good. It's never good. So I'm fine staying here on planet Earth. I just want a better planet Earth. And I lived in New York City for 4 years. I lived there during college sometimes. And then I lived there after, and I worked for film producers and I worked at HBO. And then I got a job at Paramount in 1992 and moved out and had a great career in the film industry. I produced four features, but I was mostly a studio executive. So I oversaw like 15 films a year, from small budget to big budget. Oversaw a lot of television as well. And I loved it. But I started doing historic preservation work around LA as a volunteer. And I got to save the Cinerama Dome, worked on the Capitol Records building when we thought it was under threat, the case study houses. And I love architecture and design. I love new buildings. I love old buildings. And that got me recruited onto the City of Glendale Design Review Board, which I know is sometimes seen as the enemy, right, of the housing people. But I learned about what architects go through, what they do. I did care a lot about making sure that what was built in my city was high quality and was good and fit in. And I also was very convinced that we needed to build more. So I decided to run for city council and ran and was part of doing a programmatic EIR for Glendale downtown that did a study of up to 6,000 new units in Glendale. We adopted that. And so when I was on the council, we were able to very quickly entitle thousands of new units in downtown Glendale. We upzoned the whole area and got all these new units built. And it was great. Because of that, we got the Americana at Brand, which is a big shopping mall, very fancy kind of lifestyle center with housing. The first time they had done a mall that had housing built into it. And it's super successful. I mean, people come from all over to shop there and dine there. And we created a vibrant, walkable downtown in our city.
And I think we've actually, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's all.
I was going to say, I think we actually talked about the Americana on this show before, in the context of why are the only urbanist downtowns, mixed-use downtowns we can build in America malls. But it's a lovely and it's a pretty incredible accomplishment, actually.
It's not just Americana, because Brand Boulevard, all the way from the 134 down to Americana, is also a destination spot with clubs and restaurants and shops. And so the mall works really seamlessly with them. And by forcing the mall to not turn its back on the street, that was a discussion with the developer, believe it or not. They weren't very interested in doing that. But the city of Glendale insisted that Brandon Central be seamless so that you don't really see that you're going into a mall, that it feels like part of the landscape. It was integrated very well into the city. And that whole area has been revitalized. It was an old redevelopment project area that the city of Glendale had. And so there was a lot of resources that went into Brand Boulevard and those apartment buildings, of which we have something like 5,000 units now that have been put in the last, 12 years since the programmatic EIR. There's a lot of affordable units. There are buildings that are 100% affordable. We have a building that's all for returning veterans, for instance, 100% affordable housing for returning veterans who are homeless. So, a huge need and a lot of market rate in there as well. It's a mix and it's wonderful.
But speaking of the movies you produced, in 1996, you produced the American comedy film named House Arrest, which features a plot where part of the family just live in a basement for a while. Did you think that inspired any of your views on housing?
Well, I don't let my daughter see that movie because actually in the film, the children lock their parents into the basement, put them under house arrest and force them to live there together to sort of fix their problems. So that movie is banned from my particular home. I'm just kidding. Yeah, we did do that movie and I haven't thought of that connection, but it's a good one. I like it.
Well, I think we're very excited about.
We've never had we've never had a movie producer on here, so I thought it was really cool to look into your filmography.
Yeah, it's funny. We'll bring up It Takes Two, which was a movie that a lot of people, my daughter still thinks it's the best movie ever made. So I'm not going to disagree with her. But a super cute film produced.
It was a great, I actually have seen it. It's great. I just could not figure out a housing joke to make related to it.
Yeah, it does start out in an orphanage.
Hmm.
I mean, that's housing.
That's true.
Yeah. Speaking of, I think really exciting to hear you talk about the need to convey a vision and also your background in historic preservation, right? I think it's at least my opinion. I think it's sort of our opinion that, in many ways, I think the YIMBY movement has captured most of the folks that are going to be swayed by data. And the next step really is the aesthetics and the vision and the literal mental image of what YIMBYism, what abundance, what it can bring, how that's part and parcel with historic preservation and historic buildings, how new buildings can be a part of that same kind of movement and spirit of our heritage and gorgeous architecture and gorgeous public places. So that's super exciting. Before we let you go, I'm just curious, what haven't we asked you or what haven't we talked about that you think is really important to raise and get out there before we let you get out of here?
Something you just mentioned, I think is important because one thing if you don't have the public with you, none of these policies will work. And so it's very important that we also show areas that are reluctant to add housing, very successful housing projects, that we build things that people like. And so that means making sure that we do pay attention to what the development patterns are in a community, even being willing sometimes to make things a little bit smaller, just so that they have less opposition and fit in better if they're backing up to a single family neighborhood, for instance, finding ways to integrate them into existing communities so that they become beloved by the community so that the next time someone proposes something, people say, yeah, that other one came in and it was actually really nice. We need to show proof of concept of density working well and being additive and not being something that people feel has destroyed something that they liked. So I'll just end with that because it's doable. We can do it. We have the vision. We've got the architects. We've got the will. And I love that you have a show centered around abundance. And it's something that I work on every single day and want to keep as I move forward. I'm only 4 months into my new job in Congress, but I would love to come back if you will have me to talk about ways that we are trying to bring that abundance mindset to politics.
You're welcome anytime.
Yes, come back. Sorry, go for it, Armand.
I was just going to say, if Elizabeth has anything else to ask, I want to give her this chance.
No, I just really appreciate the conversation. I really like the input you gave on, that really collaborative approach and your real world example of the bill that you passed around speeding and how you really brought the opposition, not just to kind of a reluctant place, but where they were, cheerleaders for this bill. And I think that's such a great example and, something that the pro-housing movement could, learn from on how we can bring in the opposition.
Absolutely. Well, de-siloing these things so that people understand if you're an environmentalist, you've got to support housing. If you care about housing, you've got to support transit. And making people to bring these issues together also brings in such a bigger tent of stakeholders and supporters.
Fair enough.
Got that. Publish it. All right. Congressman Friedman, thank you for creating those successful examples that we all now can point to as how this works and why it does work. And thank you so much for sitting down with us and joining us today. And let's have you back soon.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.
All right. That was Congresswoman Laura Friedman. Elizabeth, what'd you think?
Such a cool conversation. Going into this, I was thinking to myself that she is, the brand new Congresswoman for Hollywood, for the stars. But how cool that, she's not just focused on the issues that affect Hollywood. She's really focused on the issues that affect everyone in her district and specifically on the cost of housing. Her personal anecdote about when she moved to Hollywood, she was able to just, drive down the street and just see apartment after apartment that was, reasonably affordable for her pay rate. And that now, you would never be able to find apartments that are even remotely affordable. And just, she has seen firsthand how much California has suffered under the housing crisis. And so just to see her kind of like smart, reasonable approach, very solution oriented, that's what I just kept on noticing throughout our conversation with her is like, there's some, leaders who talk and there are some leaders who act. And I think she's clearly going to be in the second category of somebody who's going to want to just get down and like, what can we do about this? She mentioned climate change keeping her up at night, but again, like she's not just talking about it. She actually has a plan and, some of her ideas for improving FEMA and for improving disaster response. I think we're so spot on.
Yeah, I got, of course, very excited that she's got this Hollywood background as someone with kind of an arts and entertainment background myself, and someone who's like very, very into the idea that political storytelling matters, political aesthetics matter in terms of how they emotionally move you and put ideas and visions in your head and help you actually imagine and crystallize and have a real vision of what the future can be. I think one of my criticisms for both the Democratic Party and also I would say every single politician in San Francisco is I don't actually know in their head what does my life and everybody's life and the country look like in 10 years, right? If the Democratic Party competes in 2020, what do they actually want the country to look like in 2038, right? If it's the case in San Francisco, whether it's the mods or the progs, basically across the board, I just don't necessarily know. I know what people are bothered by, but I don't know what that image of greatness is and what you plan to make the city look like in 10 years. And I think that's part of it, and creating a vision and a little bit of the Hollywood stuff. And then a point that Representative Friedman brought up that is maybe the most important one, which goes all the way back to something that Maryland's Housing Secretary Jake Day told us, is that what matters is stories. Whether you are talking to voters, whether you are talking to elected officials, what they care about is specific stories about people and their lives and how they're affected. That's how we conceive of things as human beings. It's how we grab onto things. That's how we create empathy and relate and see ourselves in other people's journeys. And so that idea of stories, but also that focus on people feels really vital and valuable. And it's exciting to see Representative Friedman embrace that and sort of leverage a little bit of her background towards those ends.
She talked about parking minimums, right?
She did talk about parking minimums. That's pretty badass.
A member is really serious when they can bring up parking into a podcast conversation.
And when they have a record on it, when they have a record of accomplishment, and when they and this is before she was a congressman. So she got elected to Congress after having fought the local battles, which are always extremely contentious over parking. And we kind of brought up, right? Like cities, I sort of joked, but it's not a joke, right? Cities have a huge amount of abundant, free public housing, but it is not for people. It is for cars, and it's not even for cars in motion. It's for you to put your $20,000, $30,000, $100,000 piece of property out on the public street to wait for you. We have lots of spaces for those and haven't created spaces for human beings and families. And so it's really cool that Congressman Friedman fought that fight, that she's won victories in that fight, and that she's continued to build momentum and a coalition and a constituency, even with those scars.
I think it's incredible. I mean, parking minimums is one of those things that like sells really poorly, right? Like, especially if her constituency in LA, like I can imagine how difficult those conversations were. But I think it's both, it's like less radical than people are saying, you'll still be able to build the same amount of parking you could beforehand. But also it really is one of those things that in like the little weeds of it, in counterintuitive ways, makes a really big difference to whether a specific housing project can pencil or not, as well as lots of other things. And so to pick a fight that's probably, not the most popular thing in your district, but then also to be able to deliver in that California's like removal of parking minimums was one of the most comprehensive of any state in ways that we talk often about, like California did this great thing, but Montana or all these other states went really, really far ahead. This is one of those places where California's like parking minimum reform was one of the best in the country. And I think that takes an incredible amount of skill and effort to actually deliver.
It often seems like car culture is intractable, both from a political standpoint and just from like a built environment infrastructure standpoint, that there's no way out. And it's interesting to think of a couple things. One is the fact that we built it intentionally, which means we can unbuild it intentionally, right? If you think about American cities 100 years ago, right? And not just Brooklyn, but like Buffalo, Indianapolis, Cincinnati, they had robust streetcar systems. And very purposefully, we both the culture, both governments and private companies, got rid of that and replaced it with a car culture and highways and parking lots, and tore down buildings and made them parking lots and empty downtowns, right? That was on purpose. But it also means if we build car culture on purpose, we can build a pedestrian and a public transportation culture also on purpose. And you think sometimes about European cities, right? You picture like Paris right now and the walkable areas by the Seine, or, Amsterdam as this like city of bikers and biking. But that is not like historical constant truisms. Those were policy decisions. Both of those cities were filled with cars and highways and made specific choices to make them more accessible to human beings, more human scale, better for pedestrians, better for the air you breathe, better for getting around more cheaply and without the burden of having to buy a car and pay thousands of dollars every year to keep it going, and to make those cities bikeable and accessible. And actually, when you think of Los Angeles, there's few cities in the world that are better set up to be a bikeable paradise than Los Angeles. It has beautiful weather and is flat. It's well set up to be a pedestrian, biker's paradise. And it's just a matter of policy decisions and the conversations we have, and the battles we have, and figuring out how people can win, and how we can mitigate the sort of trade-offs and challenges that happen in the transitional period, knowing that transitions are tricky.
I'll also say that, I mean, you spoke, Steve, from a very urbanist point of view, and I think that's fantastic. I love cities as well. But there's also all these like different perspectives on why like removing parking minimums like removes like all these convoluted rules, right? Like, first of all, if you look at the parking minimums for any city, like in Cambridge, right? It was like, 1 per 1,000 square feet of you need 1 parking spot for every 1,000 square feet if you're storing, materials that are disposable, batteries, so on and so forth. But if there's unmanicured lumber, it's 1 per 1,600 square feet. It's 1 per 200 square feet for kiosk. It's 1 per 4 beds if it's a dormitory, but 1 per 2 beds if it's a fraternity, because we always know that guys in fraternities are going to drive more. They just need 1 per 2, right? And it's like, there's like micromanagement where you have a table of 1,000 uses and someone is trying to say like, it should be 1.75 for this use or 1.5 for that use, right? It's like, it's incredibly micromanaging in a way that no one can actually know these numbers and like adopt for the complexity of life. There's also other sorts of weird like connotations, like banks all the time. Like they're open like the smallest amount of hours, like 9 a.m. to 3 p.m., 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., right? And you're like, wow, like this bank has all this parking next door. Maybe like the, boba place next door or the Mexican place, they could use some of that parking afterwards. They could share it. So there's all this parking because like they maybe have a bar that's open late night. Parking minimums actually restrict the use to the affiliated building. So that bank is actually legally not allowed to rent out those parking spots next to that bar after night, because that parking is for that bank. You cannot use it for any other purpose under the law. And then there's the like other insane parts. Like we had like when we removed parking minimums here, one of the first projects that happened was that this elderly woman, she did not drive at all, but like her children came and she would occasionally use her driveway when they visited and everything. But what she wanted to do was just keep the driveway, but just unpave it, which made it unregulated, like made it an unofficial driveway because officially a driveway needs to be paved. And she just planted mint, which apparently you're not supposed to do because it grows like a weed, but she just planted mint all over it. And she was able to have her mint garden. And then occasionally her like children came and visited and they ruined her mint garden. But the rest of the year, she was just able to do it and have an unpaved driveway that worked perfectly for her uses. So there's all these ways that like, having super prescriptive laws, like not only doesn't achieve the intended effect, but also like takes away the flavor of life and all the different ways that people want to live. and causes all these unintended consequences.
You brought up bars. Of all the parking regulations and minimums that drive me bonkers, the top one is the fact that in the vast majority of America, if you want to open a bar, there is a certain number of parking spots you have to build. And it seems to me that this is government policy encouraging and mandating drunk driving. I mean, I don't know how else to read that. It
Well, I'll give you another one. At child care centers, they determine the number of parking by the number of children, but everybody knows you drop your children off at a child care center and then you drive home. You are not staying parked at the child care center.
And I'm very interested in how self-driving cars will kind of redefine and change how we think about cities, as well as elements of public transportation. To bring up a controversial topic, right? I remember, there's like for a long time, this is all very speculative, and you're like, oh, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what the risks are. But like at this point, at least in San Francisco, like it is proven. Like Waymo, the self-driving car company, is not only has been a super success, but genuinely like vastly safer. The data, the stats, it is super clear, so much safer than human drivers, right? When you're driving, human drivers, you've got two eyes. They can only look in a certain amount of directions at once. A lot of drivers are distracted. You have human foibles, right? The computer vision, even though it doesn't have human logic, is looking everywhere at once all the time. And they are just, statistically speaking, dramatically less accidents, dramatically less incidents, dramatically less injury and death, dramatically less accidents they create. Anytime you see any issues, not only is it far less than human driven cars, but like the amount of accidents caused by self-drive, like it's negligible in a way that's like very encouraging if you are a person who politically and morally and otherwise cares about human life and wants people to live longer and wants the world to have less death among any other urbanist goals. So I'm very interested to see. It's going to be a wildly controversial and contentious debate, but I am curious in cities. I'm curious as a nation, putting this in context of like congestion pricing in New York and how much that's improved quality of life in the air we breathe. Like, what is the future of moving from human-driven, gas-powered cars and accidents where in a single day in America, as many people die from road incidents and cars. I mean, as many people are killed from cars as if a 747 full of passengers went down in flames every day. I think if a 747 went down in flames in America every day, it would change the airline industry. But that amount of people dies from cars every day, and it still seems intractable. And I'm very curious how it will change how often we need to drive, how much storage is dedicated to parked unused cars, lifespans and quality of life and the air we breathe, to say nothing of creative and algorithmic ways to move people around and sort of like self-driven, algorithmically rooted public micro buses, right? We talked about this a little bit with Jersey City Mayor Stephen Fulop, who had sort of a hybrid of public transportation and rideshare that helped move people around and really expedited commutes and gave people more access to transportation. It's very interesting. I'm in San Jose right now. There's been a strike with the local light rail, and the mayor of San Jose actually pointed out that when commuters had their routes disrupted, they gave everybody, I think it was like $20 or $25 every day in like Uber coupons. And the mayor was like, I know that sounds expensive and ridiculous, and it is less per ride to pay people to take an Uber than to take the light rail. Now, I am, and I suspect we all are, massive fans of public transportation, government-run solutions for mobility and moving around, trains. We love trains. But yeah, I'm very interested in this world of how technology can help make public transportation cheaper, more energy efficient, more efficient in the public space it takes up, and just more convenient and better quality of life for people.
I'm actually like, I enjoy self-driving cars. I feel like they'll be really interesting, exciting addition. We see them around in Cambridge from time to time too, because MIT has their whole office and they're always testing interesting stuff. I'll say that like what I get excited about the abundance movement stuff is like there's a whole host of physical infrastructure we've been unable to build in this country, not just housing. And also that is transit in that, like self-driving cars will be a great addition. And also, you know, the Northeast is set up for the ideal conditions for really, really, really fast high-speed rail. Like New York to DC is a 6-hour drive. It's 8 hours by Amtrak. In China, it would take 2 hours. Like you could really do that in 2 hours. And that's something that we have the technology to do. And we've just not been able to build at all in this country because of all of these rules and regulations and our inability to build again. But not only do I think that we could do it, we have enough wealth and expertise and intelligence in the country that I don't see why we can't have the world's fastest train going from connecting all of our superstar cities from Boston to New York to Philly to DC and Baltimore. I think it would be incredible. And I think that's super exciting. All this physical infrastructure stuff that, self-driving cars and all these things will definitely play a critical role in, but also like all the amazing stuff where, Boston has the world's oldest subway system. New York is the world's oldest continuous system. Like we used to be the first people who built subways. The initial idea of subways was here. And the idea of like redoing that again and really pushing forward all these different technologies in abundant stuff is really exciting to me.
Yeah, overall this week, I thought was just such refreshing conversations. I think we thought a lot of how much we lost in the 24 election, but it was, this week's conversations with 4 fabulous women was also a reminder of how much we gained in the 24 election as well. Getting new, smart, policy focused, solution oriented people like Congresswoman Friedman, who are going to be real fighters in Congress for YIMBY solutions, or whether it's Councilmember Hernandez, being on the city council for Phoenix, which is a notoriously NIMBY city of sprawl, and just how much her perspective is going to, potentially change things in Phoenix. So overall, just, a really hopeful conversation, and just reminds me how much is really how much is really happening across the country in places that maybe you haven't even thought of, the incredible work that's happening in places like Arizona.
Elizabeth, I love that. If we are going to fight Trump, if we are going to take back power, if we are going to build back prominence and success and victory, both immediately in the midterms and the 2028 election, and then over the long haul for the Democratic Party, it's going to take a new generation of leadership. It is going to take an abundance mindset and a positive sum mindset. It is going to take courageous people. It is going to take work that begins at the local level and in local government and working with local communities. And it is going to take champions for progressive abundance where every American can see themselves represented and reflected in the movement for progressive abundance. And that's why I'm so excited for our next interview with 3 really amazing lawmakers from Arizona. We got a chance to sit down with Arizona State Senator Analise Ortiz, Phoenix City Councilmember Anna Hernandez, and Arizona State Representative Sarah Ligouri. I think you're going to love it. Let's get to that interview now.
Arizona is a land of extremes and contrasts. High mountains extend diagonally across the state. Many are extinct volcanoes. A few miles south of Tucson, Arizona, stands the mission of San Xavier. A drastic departure from the Spanish influence, however, is the state capital at Phoenix, the toughest little town in the west, in the hills and valleys of Arizona. There resounds the song of the cowboy, which is a fitting conclusion to our roaming through Arizona.
And now it's time for a Radio Abundance road trip. It would be better in a train. So pack your bags, because next we're headed to the land of the sun, the Grand Canyon State, Arizona. And what do we find in Arizona? Why, a trio of local lawmakers, 3 women leading the way together towards progressive abundance. Please welcome to Radio Abundance, Arizona State Senator Analise Ortiz, Arizona State Representative Sarah Ligouri, and Phoenix City Councilmember Anna Hernandez. To get us started, here's Steve Boyle.
Hey, everybody. We are here with Arizona State Senator Analise Ortiz, Arizona State Representative Sarah Ligouri, and Phoenix City Councilmember Anna Hernandez, a trio of spectacular, abundance-minded Arizona legislators who also played a big role in YIMBYs for Harris this past fall. Analise, Sarah, Anna, thank you so much for joining us on Radio Abundance.
Thanks for having us.
So great to be here.
I want to throw it over to Armand first. Actually, Armand, of course, the co-founder and really drove YIMBYs for Harris, and so I'd love Armand, if you could tell us a little bit of the story of how you met our trio and the role they played, and a sort of an opportunity here live on the podcast to thank them for the amazing work they did.
Well, so during the summer, we did this thing for folks who aren't familiar, called YIMBYs for Harris, similar to like White Dudes for Harris and Black Women for Harris. We went to organize it around housing policy because we're YIMBYs. We love Kamala Harris' housing agenda. So I created a WhatsApp group and it exploded. Tons and tons of people joined, and Representative Ligouri, who I first, I just saw like Sarah was like super helpful and wanted to connect folks to Arizona. And then at a certain point I was like, oh, like who is this person? And I realized she was actually an elected official and a representative. And I was like, wow, bowled over. And she connected us to Senator Ortiz and then Senator Hernandez, who is now on the city council. And they wanted to do something together. And we wanted to like show that YIMBY had now become like a big national. When I first started in 2015, it was really like San Francisco and New York. And unfortunately, because people could not live in San Francisco or New York or other places, all of people, and there was housing being built in like Sun Belt areas, for example. Folks are moving to places like Arizona. But now, you can't solve the problem like keeping on having other people go elsewhere, like places need to build. And so the housing crisis has come, I think, is now a national thing. And these legislators have just done really awesome work to try to advance the cause of housing. And so I want to say again how grateful I am to all of you for participating, for being a voice for housing and fighting for affordability. And I want to kick it off with sort of, we'll talk later, I think, about like how your journey started. But I think what's on top of all of our minds is like what's happening right now. There's the Starter Homes Act in Arizona that was proposed, and then there were concerns from the governor, and it's kind of there are a lot of other bills being passed. So give us like sort of a rundown of the state of play.
Go ahead, Senator Ortiz.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Yeah, so it's been quite a journey here in the state of Arizona around zoning reform that really got started in 2022 with a housing supply study committee. That was a bipartisan study committee that essentially went across the state to hear from different communities about how they were struggling with their housing shortage. Since then, we've had different iterations of this zoning reform starter homes kind of bill. And last year, in the 2024 legislative session, we were able to pass the Starter Homes Act out of both chambers with bipartisan support. It really would have just done a few things, which was to reduce minimum lot sizes, as well as crack down on design review measures that we know can often be very onerous processes that add certain regulations around aesthetics and designs of home that don't have anything to do with health or safety, but add costs for the home buyer. So that version of the bill, unfortunately, was vetoed by Governor Katie Hobbs. So this legislative session, after I had been reelected and Representative Ligouri had been reelected, we decided to give it another go. We amended the bill with bipartisan support. Again, we had 2 Republican sponsors, and on the Senate version, we had multiple Democratic co-sponsors, and we addressed the governor's concerns in that bill. That bill has now passed through the Senate with bipartisan support. The majority of the Democratic caucus supported it in the Senate, which was exciting. It got out of committee in the House, and now it's kind of been bogged down by negotiations that are still ongoing. So it has been a very long road, but I remain optimistic on the Starter Homes Act in particular, that we will be able to get something done, if not this year, in the coming years. And I will let Representative Ligouri add in anything I might have missed.
No, thank you. And hi, Councilwoman Hernandez. Well, I was just going to say, Armand, I don't know if I found you or if you found me or how I got initially added to that.
It was all a bit of a blur, to be honest.
Blur, but I was like so thankful for it because once the chat began, it was really great to see not just the quantity of people that were focused on this, on the policy, on the advocacy, on the campaign side, but just the breadth of people around the country. And then also for me, it's been such a great learning experience to hear what's going on in different states. So I just want to say, thank you, and fateful our paths crossed through there. But I think Senator Ortiz did a great job of describing it. When I went to the legislature in 2022, as a little freshman running around, people ask you, what do you want to focus on? And my biggest thing was, well, I'm a little bit worried seeing what's happening in Seattle and LA. And I think we're watching like a slow moving tsunami coming to Arizona, with homelessness increasing, and we're not building enough housing. We're not building the right type of housing. What does this all mean? I had no idea, at the time what that meant or what policy levers we could effectively pull. But that was, my freshman year, just starting to have these conversations and then crossing, paths with Senator Ortiz and working together in the House. And as she mentioned, that study committee, I think really helped kind of coalesce the policy front and legislators together to understand what do we need to start working on and how much of it is tied to zoning. And so that it's really been, even from its infancy over the past 3 or 4 years, watching it transform, I feel like we are so much more education and tuned in and trying to stay ahead of this. I shouldn't even say ahead because our numbers are not great in Arizona, but trying to stay on top of everything that's going on with housing stalling and homelessness increasing. And then also looking ahead what's coming under the next, 2 years and 4 years with this new administration, and how can we continue to double down on the work that we're doing in the state. And then just great partnerships now and I give credit to these 2 women immensely who came in and moved mountains on the housing front, to Senator Ortiz and then Senator Anna Hernandez, of doing what I don't think could have been done before in trying to get housing policy across the finish line, and now having a partnership from that state and city level, with Anna being at the city council now. So I'm very optimistic that we can continue from this point, and I'll use that as a segue to Councilwoman Hernandez.
Yeah, if you could tell us a little more about what the process was like for you for trying to get that law passed, and then how you're trying to achieve sort of similar housing policy goals at the local level.
I was going to say, Elizabeth is in Texas, and I know one thing she often talks about in Texas is that Republicans are very pro-housing there, and the Democrats are more mixed. And of course, like a bunch of us are in Massachusetts or in California, which are more Democratic. But I'm really curious how you've gotten a lot of Democrats support in places where maybe not all the Democrats are supportive of housing. I'm not sure the Republicans are great either, but just wanted to add that piece in.
Well, I'll say that I don't think either side there's great people on both sides, right? We've been able to what Sarah and Analise were talking about. We've been able to, coalesce a group of unlikely allies that want to come to the table to work. So I think it's less about party lines and more about the individual policymakers that understand and are truly invested into solving this issue. And, that was a wild experience for me the last few years. Besides housing policy, the other policy I work on is policing accountability. And the housing work that we were doing has been so much more controversial than anything I've done in the policing and criminal justice space, which is wild, right? And I think it just shows how hard it has truly been to get any real solutions done around housing and especially on the supply side. So it was a wild ride. It was a lot of real work in having to at the time I was in the Senate, getting my fellow senators to trust me as an individual, to trust the policy. And it was, we could explain the policy and show how this will truly have an impact till we were blue in the face and they still wouldn't take it. So a lot of times it really relied on our personal relationships. Like, do you trust us? Do you trust us to not support anything that's going to harm, that we wouldn't support anything that wouldn't harm our communities? And really, that's how we were able to bring folks along. I think it's funny because at the time, there was also a lot of things happening at the city level prior to me running for council. We had a big situation around displacement around mobile home residents. And the way that the city handled that specific issue through a lot of support behind us at the state level, right? Because there was legislators that are like, okay, the city's not willing to move, then we need to move at the state level. So capitalizing on those opportunities to really show the in real time impact that was happening really helped over the last couple of years. And so because, as Senator Ortiz mentioned, this year we kind of are at a stalling point. For me, going into the city, it's also has been, where can I identify opportunities to push these same zoning reforms at the city level, right? Because now it puts me in a quite unique position to be able to push more and lead, right? Phoenix is the 5th largest city in the country, and we don't really have a housing champion or a housing leader at the table. And so I think there's so much opportunity. We all recognize the difficulties ahead, but it's in building those relationships and adding more people to that coalition space and bringing more people to the table that probably wouldn't want to work on this, but are understanding how critical this is and how much of a winning issue this is.
Speaking of,
I'd love.
oh, go ahead. I was like, I think it really struck me when you were speaking is you talked about how you were having to convince other people, right? And that they have to trust you and get to build all of that. I'm curious how, because I've seen this for a lot of folks, is that there's like one person in like a legislative coalition who gets sort of figures out this issue and becomes an evangelist for it. And like for all of you, I'm curious, what was your like YIMBY journey, right? Like how did you come to believe that like the way we solve the housing crisis is to build more housing? As crazy as it is to say that out loud, it's like, a lot of people don't believe that, right? And how did you come to know that you're a YIMBY? That this thing is YIMBY exists, all of that. I'm curious to hear you guys' personal story there.
I can start real quick. For me, it was really, as I mentioned, a lot of the work I do outside of housing is in policing. And for me, housing has now become a real critical issue to public safety. And so for me, it was easy for me to go all in and take a even like way more progressive stance because of my stance on policing. And so I've recognized how to talk about this to my community members and from my own personal experience. So that is kind of what threw me into this YIMBY journey, where it's like, hey, recognizing the impact that housing can have on some of these other areas, I've tried to really build and incorporate that into my work. So that's kind of unintentionally threw me full force. And, I'm a double and triple down on the housing stances and the YIMBY stance. Like, we need more housing everywhere. We need more diverse housing. And so I try to always tie it back to some of the other critical issues that maybe other folks haven't connected the dots on. And so that has also helped bring people along the way by using housing. Like, how can we connect the dots on housing to these other areas?
And I'll jump in because I think when I think back on my journey, I think it also resonates with what I see a lot of other people's journeys are right now in understanding housing, where housing is, not everyone comes in, especially at the legislature, like everyone comes in with a very unique background, and it might be teaching, or it might be business, or, it might be, they were a dentist or whatever it is. And I feel like housing is such a unique thing that really we don't have a lot of people down there that understand what does it take to build a development and what are the nuances in there. I came in with maybe like a lap or two ahead of most because I came from a real estate development background, and I also worked in the financing space on the nonprofit side for a while. But even then, for me, it did take a lot of conscious, okay, how do we really wrap our hands around the policy, and so that's its own, bucket of learning that we had to go to. And we have a great coalition of really smart people that we work with. So it's really been relying on the relationships, the trust, the education, the communication spaces that we've been in, like collaboratively learning and helping each other. And then also taking that and going out and multiplying that to others that have no background in understanding housing, or coming in saying, I don't even know where to start on this. And what does affordable housing even mean? And what is zoning, and how do these things help?
So it's really been, and that's where I think working with, Councilwoman Hernandez and Senator Ortiz is great because we all have different strengths. We all communicate different. We have different relationships in the Senate and the House with different groups, but we're able to all come together in a way that has been able to spread what we know out to others. A lot of hand holding. We've taken legislators to affordable housing developments, toured, brought people in to speak. So it's been very heavy on the educational, the relationship building, and tying together that piece, which sounds, wow, that's very labor intensive and it takes a lot of time. And it's true, it does. But we have been able to build a coalition from maybe 5 people that understand housing and support it to 15 people that will go to bat, for housing policy. And I would now consider them YIMBYs too, because we've invested that time and resources in the relationships and the education and just continue to build upon that with time. And also the other thing is the crisis has grown. So a lot of people might not have understood it or wanted to dip in it. It's well, now it's everywhere. It's in the newspapers. It's in campaign polling. It's the number one thing we hear from constituents. So everyone is really forced to come to the table to say, okay, we have to take solutions to this seriously. And I think that's where, the 3 of us and our coalitions that we've built are really able to step into that moment and say, okay, let's clear any confusion. Let's talk about what we really need to do here to really start to make a difference on this.
Senator Ortiz, what is your YIMBY origin story?
Yeah, so I was born and raised here in Arizona, and throughout my entire adult life had dealt with having to move from apartment to apartment as my rent had been raised on me. So that was a big motivating factor for me to run. And when I started knocking on doors to win my first election, I was hearing from constituent after constituent, regardless of whether they were a young professional like I was, or if they were a senior citizen who was looking to downsize their home. They were talking about this problem of not being able to afford their rent and of not having housing choices. And as I started to do more policy research and meet more experts in the field, whether they were low-income housing providers or tenant advocates, I started to hear again and again the common theme of zoning reform. And so digging into it more once I did get elected just made me really excited to start putting forward some of these policies and working with different coalitions of housing partners to try to address this issue. And when we would talk about the lack of housing options, I had direct experience with that because I had moved so often and I knew what it was like to only have large corporate owned apartment complexes available and how that put so much of the power in the hands of the landlord. But then I had also had an opportunity to live in a small townhome where I knew my landlord. I was able to pick up the phone and talk to her, and my rent was significantly cheaper when I lived in that kind of a housing setup. But those types of housing setups where you have a small townhome or a small condo that's being rented out by a mom and pop landlord are less and less common because of the housing shortage. And being able to really see how these policy concepts apply to my own life, to my own journey being a renter and still a renter, it really helped me to recognize that this was a policy issue that had a direct impact on my life and on my constituents' lives. And I think that's what can be so frustrating in a lot of these conversations we have when we are trying to bring skeptical Democrats on board, is that there are a lot of Democrats who have been out of the housing market or haven't rented in decades. And they don't know what it's like to be looking for a home or place to live or a rental in this environment. So I'm really appreciative for the work that we've been able to do to organize, particularly young people, young renters. And we've had some of those young renters come testify at the Capitol, meet one-on-one with legislators to share their experience. And the contrast is always very stark when you see what it's like for a young person just getting their start in the professional world right now, and what, the homeowners who have owned their home for decades, who are complaining about new housing coming into their neighborhood, their perspectives are very, very different. And when you see the arguments laid out side by side, it really is a stark contrast that I think works to our advantage as YIMBYs.
I'd love to take a quick step back and build a little context around Arizona. YIMBY Democrats for America is a national organization, but I don't think it would be unfair to say we often focus a lot of energy on big blue cities and big blue states, both for the electoral ramifications of population gain and decline, and then also under the theory that if everyone who wants to live in New York, San Francisco, and LA can, that will alleviate the demand pressure and the bidding war everywhere. But for anybody listening who hasn't done a deep dive on Arizona, I'm wondering what you can tell us about the local color and unique attributes and sort of origin and history of Arizona's housing crisis that folks might not know. You mentioned earlier, Phoenix is the 5th largest city in the US. If you expand that to be looking at the entire sort of surrounding areas of cities, I think is one of our fastest growing and biggest metropolises in the country. And I suspect we'll be hearing a lot more about the housing crunch in Arizona in the years to come. I'm wondering what folks should know about what's unique or not unique about housing in Arizona.
I can jump in on that if you want. Well, Arizona has always been built, desert state, sprawl. So very, car centered, car focused, building out into the suburbs, qualified to buy. We've been dominated by real estate up until almost recently, like the last 6 years. Like it was a real estate town in Phoenix, and it's been a real estate state. And we've just started to diversify, which is its own good and bad in the sense that now we have, major international business hubs on top of business hubs, but facing those same problems of we're a city that's grown up really fast in the past 6 years. I think we were like the 4th most undersupplied market for 2 or 3 years from like 2021 till just recently. So we're attracting a lot of business, but are we keeping up with the housing that's needed here? So I always allude to it that I'm an Arizona native. And, like Senator Ortiz, have lived in literally every type of housing, you can imagine. That the days of yesteryear in Arizona are gone of being able to, find a place for $800, $1,000 a month. Arizona was so wonderful. We could work and we could pay our rent without even worrying about it up until the last 5 years. And within the last, 6 or 7 years, we've seen this rapid transition that I don't think anyone has been able to keep up with, in the sense that we were a very affordable state and just got a massive influx of people starting in 2018. And have we kept up with that? And have we kept up with that in the way that we should, in the sense that we haven't been, building dense and building up like a lot of cities have, because it's just our natural tendency to continue to build out. And so I think that's where I've been looking at, the problem is the same old that Arizona has been doing. We're now at a grown-up phase where we have to start building and doing different, because the sprawl and the building out isn't going to work. And we are now a big kid city, as opposed to being like an affordable small town, cowboy state.
Elizabeth, I think you had a question.
Yeah. So obviously 2024 was a very sad loss for Democrats nationally. And, perhaps the simplest explanation for, what happened in 2024 is that Democrats really lost the trust of voters when it came to affordability and being able to handle the economy. And, obviously Arizona voted for Trump. And so I'm wondering, how are you kind of thinking about the question of how we win back voters' trust? And how do you kind of think YIMBYism can kind of fit into that?
Yeah, I mean, as one of the only Democrats that won in Phoenix and in Arizona in November, I guess I'll lead off. I would agree. I think that the reason why was that we just didn't tap into the top line issues as much. I think there was too much of listening to the polls and, prioritizing the wrong things when, on the doors everywhere throughout, my district, we were hearing affordability and housing and homelessness is their biggest priorities. And so because of the work that I was already doing, it was easy for me to take that message to the voters. Like, hey, this is also what I'm seeing where we need to focus on. Do you agree? Like, what are your thoughts, right? Bringing them into the conversation, and sharing out what we've done, right? Like, hey, I was able to share the great things that we've done at the state level and share with them like the plan that we had But I think it's going to come down to, we really got to win their trust, and the voters, especially on the Democratic side, they need to see us out there. They need to see us delivering tangible wins that are going to ultimately change their material conditions, right? I think it comes down to that. And so if they see us as elected officials, hey, and sharing that out, like, hey, we're working on this, or I'm supporting this, like, this is how it's going to impact your everyday life, hopefully they will start to trust in us again. But I also think that part of that is, and I think this is where the YIMBY movement should really come into play, and more of our Democrats should tap in. It's like, we got to stay rooted in our values, right? Like, we cannot be moving values based on polling. And so we have to stand on business that these are the things that we really are going to fight for. This is what we support, regardless of what the polling indicates, right? And my race was a real clear messaging on that. Our top policy issue was housing and homelessness. And I won outright with 53% in the vote in a race with 4 candidates that has never been done before at the city level. Every time there's been an open seat, it has moved to a runoff. So obviously we were on track with something, right? We took the issue to the voters that they were saying, hey, we need help on this. So it's going to come down to listening to them, bringing them into the conversation, and then delivering for them. And then sticking true to our values, and housing is something we have to believe in, because it's such a cornerstone to every other issue. So we can't be soft on housing. We can't be MAGA light on housing and everything else, and expect that the voters are going to trust us.
And to give a real example of a tangible win that we were able to pull off last year was the Casita bill. So we were able, with Senator Anna Hernandez's leadership, being one of the primary sponsors of one of the accessory dwelling unit bills, we passed one of the most robust ADU bills in the country that legalized backyard casitas in the largest Arizona cities. And while we were working on that, we got a lot of flack, of course, from the cities, from the local governments, but also from some of our fellow Democrats who were trying to use the issue of short-term rentals as kind of an excuse to not pass the Casita bill. So at this time, we were doing the work on the state level. The city of Phoenix, who had kind of sat around on their hands on a Casita ordinance for about 3.5 years, were upset by the state trying, 5 years, Anna says. The city of Phoenix was kind of trying to say, okay, we don't want to be preempted. We'll show you that we can do something on this Casita ordinance. So after sitting on their hands for 5 years, they started to have the real conversation about getting their Casita ordinance into law. And they did it. We pressured them to do it the same year that the Casita bill was moving. Well, I made a TikTok video talking about the city of Phoenix Casita ordinance. And a man named Jose, who I had never met before, saw my TikTok, and he started following me on TikTok. And he started to really jive with not just the casitas, but who I am as a candidate in my campaign. So one day he reached out and said, hey, I want to volunteer for your campaign. I said, great, I need a driver. Come drive me as I walk and knock door to door. As Jose was driving me around that day, he starts to tell me, I learned about you from TikTok because you talked about the Casita thing. And guess what? I just got an email showing the blueprints for the Casita that I'm going to build because me and my wife are expecting a new baby. And we into the backyard Casita while our teenage kids live in the main house. And it still gives me chills to this day that we were able to do that, right? We had a real tangible impact on Jose's life that not just made it possible for him and his new baby and his wife to have a place to live, but also that inspired him to be getting involved with campaigns, which he'd never volunteered on a campaign before he had come to drive me door to door. So these are the types of moments where it makes all the bullshit we deal with when trying to put this legislation through, it really makes it worth it.
Wow, that's an amazing story.
Something top of mind for me. I really think of the YIMBY movement as founded by women. I think of Sonia Traus as kind of the godmother of the YIMBY movement. Laura Foote comes to mind as a legend of the movement. Both are actually young mothers. And so if you go to a YIMBY event in California, as we did the other day, there's young kids running around, which is both very joyful and inspiring, and also a part of the housing conversation. If you look at the demographics of lawmakers in this country, and if you look at the demographics of our own movement, there's a lot of dudes. So we have the great honor today to talk to three kick-ass women who are Democratic lawmakers and abundance pioneers. And for each of you, I'm curious to what extent, if at all, gender has played a role both in your own personal fight for your political voice and any bullshit you've had to overcome along the way, as well as to what extent it might have shaped any of your housing views with dimensions that deserve more attention and centrality in our national conversations on housing and abundance.
What a question. What a question.
I love this question because I worked in real estate, and in Arizona and Phoenix in real estate, it literally is an all boys club. It was me and one other woman in the office. But coming from an all boys world, which was, real estate in Arizona, and still for the most part, sadly continues to be, I take great pride because rooms that I'm in now, whatever room I'm in now, like it is overwhelmingly women. And, looking at these two women and looking at all the different groups that we're in, like it is predominantly a lot of women in this space. And sometimes I say that and men get mad at me for saying that. And I don't say it in a way. I'm just like, I am just observing and reporting back that like these are, 90% of these spaces that we've been in have been women. And so it's just a point of pride to me to look around the legislature, look around, I think now the city council, and look around some of our coalition building groups where sometimes it's 100% women. And we come in, we brainstorm, we put it all together, and we're able to leave. And it's something you don't think about unless you stop to be cognizant of it. But I think it's been really powerful to say and to look at the coalitions that we've built that are women of all ages, of all stages of life, coming together around these issues.
Yeah, I mean, I always joke and I'm like, when you need something done, send the women in. But even like the year before that, Senator Ortiz and I got to the legislature, right there, it was the housing bill was introduced, and it didn't really move. And then the next year, Senator Ortiz and I come into the legislature. We land ourselves in the middle of a housing policy, and we really ran circles around so many other people. But there's a lot of barriers with that. As Senator Ortiz mentioned earlier, like we've been taking a lot of rocks, a lot of arrows, a lot of shots, right? Our names have been dragged through the mud because of the housing things that we're working on. And especially as two women of color, I think we saw it even more. And I literally had people saying that we were I was being manipulated and taken advantage of by some of the partners working on housing. And I'm like, that's kind of a discredit to my intelligence. I also, prior to running for office, I worked in mortgage for about 15 years. Mm-hmm. So I totally understand the business from that aspect, right? So not only is it my life experience, but also my work experience is in the housing industry for 15 years. And so people didn't do their homework on it. So they didn't understand how I was going to come to the table. And in that, bring more, no, we need to talk about this. I'm also very, I'm an Aries, so I'm very like fiery. So I'll go into rooms and say the things that need to be said, right, without fear and all of that, and call things out. But also recognizing how I need to talk about different things in different rooms. But there was a lot of that. There was a lot of pushback from fellow Democrats that didn't want to trust in my work and in how much we're doing on housing legislation, simply because I'm a woman of color. So had to work extra hard and convince people and really show like we can win these things, and to be part of the group that delivered on this one of the strongest casita legislations across the country was just the result of all the work, and all those rocks and all those arrows were totally worth it. Because now I'm part of the group that can say, well, this is cool. You guys don't want to support this, but this is what we did in light of that, right? So it's like pointing to that and bringing other people along and getting more people involved to be advocates and to support these measures has been pretty cool. So it's worth it. The rocks and the arrows have been worth it, and will continue to be worth it.
You
And I
know,
think
Councilmember Hernandez, I was going to say that that is the first mention of astrology on Radio Abundance. Your
Yeah.
award scale. I don't know. I'm a Cancer. Are everybody else? Are we compatible? How do we back up?
I'm well, actually, very fortuitous day for this because we have a new pope named Leo. I'm a Leo.
And so an Aries. So
Oh,
yeah, we had that Aries energy going into some housing work.
I mean, you need that to deal with this stuff. You all have to deal with it.
And I think that's also why it works, because sometimes we say, good cop, bad cop when we go into some of these conversations. And so we also have the astrological sign balance of it too.
Senator Ortiz, curious
Yeah.
your perspective on.
So the other thing I wanted to add, I think Sarah and Anna wrapped it up beautifully about being women, but I think as being Latinas in particular is important in this movement, because what we saw with the accessory dwelling unit bill was that so many of our community members on the West Side, where I represent, as well as on the South Side, they already had casitas in their backyard. Whether or not it was legal, there are a lot of people that have the skills of being able to build and construct an accessory dwelling unit, and they don't want the city called on them because they don't have the right permits or the right ordinance. So when we're allowed to come in and say, hey, this is legal now, totally fine for you to build your casita, people were so excited about it. And I think there also is such a desire in our Latino community to live multi-generationally. It really is a norm for a lot of Latino families for college students to live at home until they finish their degree, which is what I did. I was able to live with my parents. And so to be able to construct an ADU in your own backyard, to have some privacy while you are still going through school, but still being able to be with mom and dad, to not have a $2,000 a month rent payment, is really, really important when it comes to basic prosperity for our gente in getting ahead, as well as for caring for our elders. It's also very much a cultural desire to be able to take care of your abuela, abuelo, or whoever it might be, so that they can age near their loved one and have the privacy, be able to retire with dignity, but still have that closeness of family. And that messaging has been so it's almost not even a challenge to explain to our community why these things are needed, because they already live it and experience it and want it. And so leaning into that, into knowing what our community needs and following the lead of our community, really, I think, played a big role in helping us get the casita bill across the finish line.
Speaking of casitas, so all of you have talked about them quite a bit. In California, they're really the only form of housing. We're still having a lot of success producing more. I noticed that there's legislation recently passed that changed it. So you guys did casita reforms in the past, and then recently, I think the governor signed a bill to allow there to be rentals. Is that a recent change, or is that? You can tell us a little more about that one. I'm curious.
The version we passed last year, there was a STR stipulation in there that if they were going to be used as STR, the principal unit had to be owner occupied. So we tried to pass it with guardrails. I think this session, or the recent one, was to bring that same legislation to county, I think is what we finally were able to move this year. But Sarah and Analise can speak more to that, to the current one.
Yeah, that's right. There was, as I said, a lot of concerns around, that people are just going to use these ADUs as short-term rentals, and we already have too many Airbnbs. And really, the opposition tried to use that to derail the legislation. So the stipulation we put in there was that if a city wanted to say that one of the units, either the primary unit or the ADU, must be owner-occupied if it's being used as a short-term rental, the cities have the flexibility to do that if they so choose. So I think it helped with quelling some of the opposition, but of course not all of it.
I had a question. I think that we're really excited about the national movement. Like I remember at the DNC last year, like President Obama, former President Obama didn't go up there and say zoning per se, but he kind of heavily alluded to it, which was like about as excited as we could get. And then obviously it was Jim for Harris and everything. And since then in Congress, we've seen, this Unity Caucus form. There's more recent news about an Abundance Caucus. I was wondering if there was any updates on, anything that's happening in the Capitol around, housing, zoning, abundance related stuff in general.
We did form a housing and homelessness caucus this year. So that was a bipartisan and bicameral. So House and Senate came together. Analise is leading it in the Senate. I'm part of it in the House. So yes, we are trying to build upon that. I think we're also trying to get deeper in even like the city and the state level work. We're working with, different mayors around the state and even different council members around the state that have this abundance YIMBY that are like, we're gonna do what's maybe the hard thing, especially at that local level, to bring more density, to bring more projects in the areas that we need. So we've seen it take off. I wish that we had been able to do more with the Housing and Homeless Caucus, this year that was centered around policy. But again, I think we're still in that infancy stage of where we're really trying to educate and pull people in to talk to them about what's happening along the spectrum and have it, hone in on policy potentially as we continue to build that.
Senator Ortiz, you mentioned that you and Councilmember Hernandez are both Latinas, and I'd actually like to ask a question on this because I think there's a very important kind of through line in housing debates, but also just solving the policy of how we can protect and celebrate cultural neighborhoods, cultural character, cultural communities, while also building more housing to make sure that for everybody, especially those folks, they can afford their rent and afford to stay where they are. Sarah, I apologize. This question is not for you. I assume you and I are both at least half Italian-ex. But for example, in San Francisco, there's an amazing Latino neighborhood, which is the Mission District. Because it's so vibrant and exciting, a lot of people who are not Latinos move there. There's incredible pressure on rents. Gentrification sometimes comes from luxury towers. It also sometimes comes from not building luxury towers so that the people who were going to live in them instead go after the existing housing and displace the residents. And I think one of the dangers of scarcity and the 50-year crisis of scarcity we've built up is it pits people against each other and makes people really afraid of change and threats to community and threats to evolution. And one thing I'm constantly thinking about is how can we both, protect, preserve, embrace, enhance, celebrate cultural communities, and also allow that cultural character and local neighborhood character not to dissipate or be encased in amber, but thrive and, rise as high as we can build. And I'm just curious, and from your perspective on that wider issue in policy, on the trade-offs when it comes to those communities and new housing, and the political side of this, which is, I think, certainly I can say in San Francisco, that the Latino community in the Latino neighborhood in the Mission District, I think is, very reasonably so, probably one of the most anti-housing communities in San Francisco, because the threats to that, the continuing sort of a growth and preservation of that culture are so real and immediate and visible. I don't have the solution here, and I'm hardly the right guy to ask the question, but I'd love to know what your perspective is on that.
Yeah, I think it's a delicate balance, and I will love to hear Senator or Councilwoman Hernandez chime in as well. But so one thing I did want to mention earlier was that Phoenix is also a very racially segregated community. There, of course, is a long racist history of pushing Black and Brown people into South Phoenix, which is majority Black neighborhoods that, the city has not been mindful from all the way back to when the highway was first built, dividing the community and displacing the community to a lot of the industrialized zoning that makes the air less clean and the quality of life and the lifespans shorter in South Phoenix. And then in the West Side, where I represent in Glendale, I had residents who told me when I was knocking doors that they remember when the Glendale police would sit on the train tracks waiting for any Latinos to go north of the train tracks to stop them right away and say Latinos can't go north of the train tracks in Glendale. And so our community in the south side of Glendale is majority Latino because that racial segregation still has so much of an impact and has had generational ramifications. And so I think it's really an important question that we do need to be considering when it comes to ensuring that people who have ties to the community should be the ones that are able to have first dibs when it comes to moving into new projects, whether they are low income or workforce housing that's being built. I think we also need to look at community land trust models and how we can be building wealth for people in the communities that they already have been in. And so those are definitely things that we want to continue to explore. The south side of Phoenix also had put into place a transit-oriented development plan as they have had the city's light rail expand into South Phoenix, to make sure that housing that's being built along the light rail is being done in tandem with the community. And again, giving the people who already live there the ability to move into those new units. And so those are all tools that we've seen that I think are working, but I think it's paramount that elected officials are building trust with those communities of color and doing everything we can to ensure people are not displaced, as we saw in Phoenix when Anna had alluded earlier to the mobile home park. The people who were displaced there was because Grand Canyon University was expanding its footprint. So it wasn't necessarily housing that was being built. It was this college campus that was displacing mobile home residents. And when that happened, the mayor of Phoenix would not let those mobile home residents speak during public comment. But yet, anytime we talk about other housing development or by right development, the city's very first punchline is, you're taking away the residents' right to participate in the process. But when it's Black and brown folks who want to participate in the process, we're shut down. So we have to be sure that we are not using this issue of public participation as an excuse when it's convenient, but then not leaning into public participation when it really benefits Black and brown voices.
Yeah, and I'll just add that recently Rashad Thomas wrote an article that shows that Phoenix is the 9th most gentrified city in the United States. And, from my humble opinion, I think a big part of that is scarcity, right? Is the lack of abundance in housing, and how a housing shortage does contribute to gentrification, because as you said earlier, when there's a limited supply available, people that need the housing are going to go look elsewhere. And if we don't build housing everywhere, we're going to continue to displace people and continue to cause gentrification in communities, in Latino communities and Black communities. And for me, it's so important to have community-centered policy in that. And why I said it while I was in the legislature a lot, like, it is so important to also undo exclusionary zoning, right? When we're talking about policy. And that has been one of the biggest frustrating battles to have with my fellow Democrats, that at this point, I'm just at a point where I'm going to call things what they are, right? Like, if you're going to continue to hold up these exclusionary zoning practices, then you are contributing to segregation and you are contributing to the harm that is coming to my community. So for me, it's a lot of the work has been in speaking to that, understanding my own history in the community and the history of my communities, and then working with community partners that are truly centered in good solutions. Like, how do we elevate the community? How do they have access to the same tools that other folks have? And really trying to change that part of it. It's a complicated issue, right? Because zoning in itself is such a complicated thing. But it just goes to show that abundance is going to also be a path to equity for Black and brown communities, especially here in Phoenix. So I think it's gonna take a lot. We need a lot of different tools, but I agree with Analise, like the community land trust. How do we make community members like micro developers so they can actually build their own communities because they're heavily invested into that community, and then find ways to incorporate our culture and our arts into those same developments. So I think that's just a few of the things that need to happen, and it's going to be the work that's on the horizon for us.
Well, this has been an amazing conversation so far and a real honor. We let you get out of here in a second, but before we do, I want to pass it to Armand for a final question. And as you answer this, I also want to give you permission to, if there's anything that we didn't get to today that you're thinking, man, we should have talked about that, feel free to weave that in and give us some parting thoughts. Armand, the floor is yours.
Sure. So I want to make up for the fact that my last policy question, I kind of like garbled a little. We have a very nerdy audience. Obviously, given I'm here, the nerd factor's off the charts. But I think our audience would really love to hear some like a breakdown of like the legislation that you either passed recently that you're really excited about and why you think will make a big impact, and the legislation you're currently hoping to try to pass, like, in detail, sort of like, what will it change? Why you think it'll be effective? We'd love to hear that. And then to end with like what Steve said, like, what else should we have asked you about, and how can we help you and support?
Who wants to start off?
Sarah, I've got two things that come to mind, so I'm happy to jump in here. It's a little bit of, and I try not to be like a bad news bearer like all the time, but it's a little bit of a sad state of affair, with the housing landscape in Arizona right now, especially where we're at in the legislative process with, we're recessed and we have a budget to do. And we have to get that done in the next, month and a half. But looking at the landscape of housing this year has been less optimistic than it was last year. And we're fighting, we have fights with even our director of housing getting confirmed. She just had to step down. They're trying to not continue it for longer than 1 year. They don't want any money in housing trust fund. They don't want to fund LIHTC. They're trying to pass all these bad homelessness bills. So from the legislative front, there's, I think, more negative than positive that's come out this year. And that's just saying that's what the landscape is in Arizona right now. But, one thing that also failed that I was working on, and I think I put it in the chat at one point, was the Yes in God's Backyard bill. And that ties into, just a segue on the abundance, and the district that I represent can be very NIMBY and the opposite of what we're talking about of, large acre lots and, getting emails from constituents saying, our neighborhood is full. So it just is the definition, of scarcity to me as, we're talking through all of this. So we're hoping that we can, continue to work on utilizing church property, utilizing school property. We've caught something there. There's a church or school property that's going to be developed, and we're hoping that we can start to scale that across the state. And then the other, like, in the weed thing I'm really excited about is the condo defect rule that I don't know how many states it's being worked on here, but it's a huge problem, and it has been a huge problem in Arizona. And when you look at the housing spectrum, we really have not had anyone building, attached townhomes and condos in the last 10 to 12 years because of this. And it stalled this year again for the second year in a row, but we're really coming at it very robust. And then again, in partnership with the city, Councilwoman Hernandez, I know, will be picking this up, and we've been working with one of her colleagues down there too. So I think it's another city partnership.
Our audience, could you just explain like with the condo defect stuff?
Well, yes. Sorry, I thought we were like nerdy level there.
We have in the weeds audience, but I think this is, Armand, correct me if I'm wrong, this is a top thing for you, is it not?
It's one of my like new obsessions. Yes. So.
Me too. Okay.
Tell the people what it is.
Well, I became middle-aged. I'm 35 now. Like, all my friends like are having babies, and then they want to buy a home, and they can't be in the city, right? So they leave. So it's like now it's something I've tried to figure out what's going on, and Representative Ligouri can explain.
Well, I'll give a high level and then jump in, but basically it was me finding out about this, 10 plus years ago from my friends who built this type of product of saying, hey, we're not going to, how's your, 12 unit townhome complex? Oh, we're not going to build those anymore. Why? Oh, because there's, groups of attorneys that have moved into Arizona and they're suing anyone under this condo defect rule where they go from project to project and find flaws, get the homeowners to come together and they sue the builder. It could be, I've heard things like broken garage door handles, things that are, very small, but the cost of insurance goes up for builders so high that it makes it, it adds a layer to how expensive it is for them to get insured to build the project because these lawsuits were so prevalent and expensive for them, so that builders literally stop building. And another thing I think unique to Arizona is that also opened the gates to the build to rent community taking over. So we've seen everyone move to the build to rent model as a byproduct of not being able to build shared wall products, condos, townhomes, things of that nature. And also we have a loophole in our water laws that they don't have to prove the water supply if they build to rent. So we've got those two things layered into why build to rent is being so crazy down here. But that, affordable, diverse, middle of the road product has become too expensive for builders to build because of the insurance reason and the liability. So that's where we've seen other states. I think Montana just passed it too, working on condo defect. And so it's been a big priority that I'm optimistic about we can, get done next year.
I remain optimistic about working on some piece of the Starter Homes Act. I think we are going to probably need to pivot to taking smaller bites at the apple. I'm really looking forward to see what happens with Texas's Starter Homes Act, which is similar to what we tried to pass. But I think just a basic reducing minimum lot sizes across the board should be an easy piece of legislation to get done. And it's been wild that we have had a challenging time. But I think if we were to do just a clean version of reducing minimum lot sizes in Arizona, we could hopefully have some success. Another thing I really want to work on that I think would be tough, given our current political landscape, is parking reform. The minimum parking requirement in Arizona for multifamily housing is just ridiculous. And not only does it add to the costs of constructing new multifamily, but it also reduces the amount of homes that can actually be on the plot of land. And then on top of that, Arizona is hot and it contributes to our heat island effect, which is already terrible. And so the last time I tried to work on reducing minimum parking requirements, the Republicans tried to kind of take it and turn it into this 15-minute cities. The Democrats want to take away our guns and our cars now. It was just absolutely ridiculous. And so I felt the past couple of years that there was no real pathway to getting parking reform done, but I still want to work on it on the legislative level. Maybe it's more of a transit-oriented development type model where we reduce the parking requirements the closer you are to light rail or a major public the bus stop and transit station or something of that nature. So I want to keep noodling on that, and hopefully we can have some Republican states take the lead on that, because it is a very bipartisan issue. And if we can get Republican buy-in in other states, maybe we can get Arizona Republicans to see that it's important. But also we could work on parking reform on the local level. And with that, I'll turn it to Councilwoman Hernandez.
Yeah, they sent me to office with a laundry list of items that they want me to, like, okay, cool, this is what you need to add to your list. But all stuff I'm very excited to work with them on. So definitely condo defect. I actually introduced the bill 2 years ago around that, but we hit barriers with that, and we had to prioritize the casita bill last year. But excited to work.
If you just explain, I think Representative Ligouri did a great job explaining the problem. I'm curious how you guys are thinking of solving this. Like, what did that bill propose to do?
That bill proposed to reduce the number of years that lawsuits can be brought. Not complete. It wouldn't eliminate it. It would just reduce it, I think, by 2 years. And then it was also wanting to change the number of folks that had to sign on to the lawsuit. Which kind of ties into my other thing, that it's a big vision and it's going to be really, really hard to tackle, and might even be harder than starter homes. but HOAs. I want to abolish HOAs. Would love to get support. I don't know where YIMBYs fall on that, but I absolutely loathe HOAs. So that's a big vision. But besides condo defect, going into council, I also am excited to get to start working on a Phoenix version of the starter home legislation. That's probably going to be one of the biggest policies that I start with. And then what else is there? I mean, there's so much stuff to do. I think a part of it, the bad news side of it is just being on the defensive against a lot of housing grant money that's being cut from the cities, from the federal level. So it's being on the defense on a lot of housing fights to protect what we have. But we'll see how that plays out. But overall, just excited to really collaborate with my state legislators, my state senator, my personal state senator, and one of my favorite state reps. I can't say favorite because other of my faves might fight me, but my favorite housing representative, and how we can collab at the different levels. I think that is a piece that we haven't tapped into enough, is building those partnerships at the different government levels. And now we have an amazing opportunity to do it here in Arizona, and hopefully be successful in that. And maybe that would be a model for others to tap into.
Well, Councilmember Hernandez, Senator Ortiz, Representative Ligouri, it was an honor to work with you in the fall, and it is an honor to get a chance to chat with you and sit with all of you today. So thank you so much for joining us on Radio Abundance, and thank you so much for everything that you have done and continue to do on housing and abundance.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Keep going.
That was Arizona State Senator Analise Ortiz, Arizona State Representative Sarah Ligouri, and Phoenix City Councilmember Anna Hernandez. Elizabeth, what'd you think?
Really loved that conversation for so many reasons. One, it was just so inspiring to see, three women who have made such a difference in local politics in Arizona. And it was so cool to see the way that they just truly respect and support each other. And, they mentioned different ways that they've, pitched in and been good cop, bad cop for each other. It was just really inspiring. And it's not something you always see because, at different points they were in the House and the Senate and now, in the City Council in Phoenix. So they're playing in these different roles, but it was so clear that they have a deep friendship and a deep working relationship that I just think is just, such a great model. So it's just really inspiring for me. I think the other thing, I live in Dallas, Texas, they're all in Arizona, and there's a lot of similarities between Arizona and Texas. And that is that we're being overrun by Californians. In Texas, we like to say, don't California my Texas. And I have to imagine, folks in Arizona sometimes feel the same. So we're two Sunbelt states that have really, thanks to our more friendly housing market, have seen a huge influx of people moving in from more cost prohibitive states like California. And, it's two states that are having to learn to accommodate that population growth. And so they couldn't just rest on their past laurels of we've always had a really, good housing market. Now they're having to accommodate new growth. And that can be a tough conversation. Because, when you're seeing a big population increase, there's a little bit of a tendency to go towards a scarcity mindset of get these Californians out of here. But, on the YIMBY side of things, where our solution is, no, we can build more. We are big enough for everybody. There's enough land. Come on in, we'll make room for you and we can keep on building. So, I as a Texan, I found a lot that I really connected with. And I was just so inspired by their personal stories, too, of how they got into this work.
Yeah, it's funny. I was very excited to Californiaize Texas back when I thought we'd turn it blue. But in 2024, Democrats lost Texas by 2 million votes. So I think we now need to make sure that Californians who want to stay in California can stay in California, which will alleviate. We brought this up we brought this up in some conversations, right? If you even just focus on the San Franciscos and the Los Angeleses and the New Yorks and the San Diegos and the Chicagos, as long as people who want to live there can live there and aren't being pushed further and further away into cheaper areas and cheaper states, that even just those municipalities has a big effect on alleviating and resolving a lot of the demand pressures on a really growing and thriving metropolis like a Phoenix, that where rents are skyrocketing and where the bidding war is happening as these exiled and banished Californians take over and drive up costs with their California money. Um, I also love what you said about them working together as friends and a team, and what like a real delight to get a trio of folks who are like they're kind of colleagues, but they're here because they're friends and they're a coalition unto themselves, right? In our first episode, we did sit down with Maryland Governor Wes Moore and his Secretary of Housing Jake Day for a dual interview. But Jake Day also works for Wes Moore. That's a government structure, and the governor and his housing guy. And this is a case of like three women, three kick-ass Democratic lawmakers and abundance-minded pioneers who are friends, and out of that natural relationship find ways to work together to further the causes they care about and to support each other. And I thought that was really beautiful.
Yeah, I'll add that, when Beto was running in Texas, there was so much about that after that election that, there was a 2-3 point margin that Beto actually won native Texans. It was actually the people who moved to Texas that he lost against. And it's because both, people who end up leaving blue states in particular, but it's expensive markets in general, are not, your, high class tech workers. It's, your average worker who've been increasingly like losing in the Democratic Party, but also people who end up being forced to leave California or Massachusetts and move to Texas are actually very resentful of the policies that made them move and how expensive it is. And so it really, it's sad to think that in a different world where, housing markets were easier in California, that Texas would have flipped blue, and like the numbers were actually there for native Texans. And so that's a little bit of a sad memory. It was also really cool to see, all the work that they're doing in Arizona. There was also, both the gender piece of it, but also the Latina piece of it, of like, Latinos having these big families, and in particular ADUs allowing you to have grandparents, other members of the family, kids who are maybe in college and want a little bit of space for themselves live in there. And it was really exciting. A lot of the places that have legalized ADUs, Arizona, California, I think the Pacific Northwest, in general, also places that have a pretty sizable Latina community or Latino community, as well as other minority groups, in a way that is very interesting. You go to the South and there's just not been a lot of action in ADUs, nor to the same extent in the Northeast. And so I thought that was a really interesting, smaller correlation there.
Burhan, it is such a good point, all the points you make. I think it's very easy to look at near Elizabeth, a place like Austin, and think about, oh, look at some liberal tech folks moving in. And I know liberal tech folks who got priced out of California and went to Austin. But the data shows exactly what you're saying, Burhan. It is Republican voters and red voters who are leaving blue states where housing is expensive and leaving places like California in droves and going to places like Texas and influencing a swing state like Arizona and growing Republican power there. And that narrative is still prevalent in California, that it's blue voters leaving and we're exporting blue voters. And that is not what's happening. And I would suggest both that you've got an exodus of just like people who are already red voters, but probably also if you're being priced out of a blue state and you're not happy with how that blue state is being run, that's also potentially radicalizing you to become a red voter as you leave. So I suspect the causality works in both directions in ways that are very disadvantageous for Democrats, and where the only solution is strong, compelling, competent, effective blue state democratic governance to address those concerns and provide a good vision of blue governance centered around building housing so that people can live where they want, stay in the states they want, and places with nice weather and places with jobs and where their families are, and also feel like they can thrive and like they're being supportive and like both the government is working and the culture and the markets are working. I think that only happens if Democratic leaders build housing. Brian, I also love you brought up that we discussed gender and we discussed race. And I was both really thrilled that we got to have those discussions, very nervous about talking about asking those questions, and curious for feedback on how we handled it. But I think it's like those challenging questions around how housing and high rents and scarcity and defending yourself from the threats of scarcity, how those manifest in cultural communities, how, when there aren't enough representative voices from women, enough represented voices from Latinos or different ethnicities, what do you miss in terms of the importance of housing, in terms of the experience of housing and the experience of scarcity and not building housing, and what that means both for how we elevate those views in our conversations around housing, how we honor them in policy, and how we optimize our policies and our construction and our markets in ways that really support people, ways that lift everybody up, ways where everybody can thrive, and ways where culture, instead of being displaced by wealth or eradicated by monoculture, but where culture and tradition and the beauty of those ideas and that history and that ancestry that can thrive and not just be preserved but be extended, where that neighborhood character can be treasured, not as something to like freeze, but as something to grow and take upwards to the skies. And so I'm curious for both of you, yeah, what you thought of that conversation, both in the form of it and how we can talk about it and have those sometimes challenging conversations. And also your personal perspective, Elizabeth, as a woman, Burhan as a person of color, and what you thought of what our trio had to say on these questions.
I think there's a real stereotype of like Yimbys mostly being men. This idea of like the abundance bros, and like it's usually like, like if you ask ChatGPT to show me like a Yimby, it'd probably be like, like some tech guy like in San Francisco or something. But like my experience in Texas is that it's largely been led by women. Some of the most important efforts that are happening right now at the state legislature in Texas have been led by women. Some of our best Yimby Democrats in Texas, and there are enough of them, are often women. So I think, sometimes what we see on Twitter and what we see happening in real life in our state capitals is very different. And so I thought this conversation was just so refreshing and a good reminder.
Yeah. I'll say that it's been the same experience for me in Massachusetts. Like every person of color in Cambridge City Hall has voted for zoning reform, and generally that's applied to greater efforts at the state level and things like that in general. I'd say that it's hard to avoid talking about like gender or race or all these things that impact your background. We also talk about like being a renter, right? And how that impacts how you view housing. Like it plays a huge part of like me realizing that housing is so expensive that you need to do something about it urgently. I think it's important to also just understand that it's not the complete story, and it plays a different part in different people's lives. Like some people are deeply connected to their ethnicity, other people less so. And so like there's a huge range of, ways that people's background plays into who they are. And just understanding that, like, a person is not their background either. But, I think that those challenges are always difficult because you never know who exactly a person is. And it's part of finding out who people are. But it's great. And I think it's valuable. In Cambridge, actually, it's a funny story of like, over the last year, there's been a lot of tensions on foreign policy for a whole variety of reasons. But two of the strongest ethnic groups who were supportive of more housing in Cambridge were both like people who are like very religiously Muslim and very religiously Jewish. And it was partially because the Jewish community, like, especially if you're very Orthodox, like, and you maybe want to live near your synagogue because you don't use technology on certain days of the week and those sorts of times. But also if you're like Muslim and you want to have that like larger family size, but like live near the mosque, like both of those like deeply religious communities really benefited from having housing near like your religious institution. And so it was really funny in that way. And there's other sorts of things that are background. Like there's so much of a saying that if your country speaks English, you probably have a housing crisis, where it also has to do with like zoning is inherited from this like Commonwealth system. And so Australia and England and America and Canada have like a housing crisis. And like, there are all these roots and stuff like that. And it's hard to ignore, and you shouldn't need to ignore it. But like, it's not also the full story, and that's okay.
Bro, that's such a good point. The worst housing crises in the world are Anglo countries. And I think it's very savvy to look at the historical roots of that. Elizabeth, you suggested that if we asked ChatGPT to create an image of a Yimby, that'd be a white guy, and I decided that this gave me enough time to put that to the test, and you will not be surprised. It is a young white fellow with hipster glasses, exactly as you would imagine the stereotype to be. Burhan, I'm curious, as an elected official, as somebody working in your community in Cambridge. How do you think about both connecting like with different communities and how you sort of honor their perspective, honor their past, honor their culture, speak in their language, and sort of communicate directly with like empathy and great knowledge of your audience without veering into like tokenizing and making assumptive stereotypes and acting like every community is like exactly like its loudest activists, and actually like alienating people by forgetting those like universal common things and human needs and American traits and values that really unify us. How do you think about synthesizing those two ideas in your work and your relationships?
I actually think it's the beauty of being in like local politics in particular is that most of us live in our own bubble. Like not necessarily there's the bubble, but all of us have our local community of people we hang out with, and that's how we see the entire world. And politics, especially at the local level, means that you have to interact with all these different communities in a very direct way. Like I represent 120,000 people, and what's crazy about Cambridge, because the average resident has like a master's degree and it's insane, is that on average, the yearly viewership is 50,000 unique people watch our city council meetings, which is an insane level of like number of people who are active and paying attention. And so that means you hear all the opinions, right? And in that community, like it's really hard to be stereotypical because even if you come in with that experience, you very quickly like meet all these people who fit into these very unique, very different boxes. And in all these different sorts of ways that you never even thought about beforehand. I already talked about like the religious examples and all that sorts of stuff. But I'll also say like it's how it's different within even like amounts of religiousness within different things, like in traditional religious communities, even in cross Christianity, how like that big family means that you're in general favor of like bigger unit sizes. So there was a conversation of, do we want to ban bigger like units because we don't want 4, 5, 6 families because those might be McMansion. We should limit housing to like 1, 2, 3 bedrooms. And both like people who are very religious in terms of having big family sizes were very opposed, but also people on the very other, maybe not the very other end, but a different, very unique community is that we have a very large queer alt community in Cambridge. And so people who wanted to live in a large poly household and like have all this, these sorts of like different sorts of lifestyles were also very opposed because they wanted to have, large 6, 7 bedrooms so they can have like 12, 14 people in that. And so it's just funny, all the different sorts of, people you run into.
It's very interesting. You mentioned, the queer community and the poly community. I think a lot. So, my background is being in San Francisco and working in the artist community, which is very progressive. It's very leftist, and it's very queer and gender fluid, and sort of the core of the teammates I've worked with, the incredible artists I've worked with. The majority are people of color. The majority are women, and a massive amount are queer, are gay, are trans. And it's been one of the really vexing things living in San Francisco. San Francisco's housing crisis, the self-enforced scarcity, the bidding war that creates, and the skyrocketing rents means that essential promise of San Francisco. You think of Harvey Milk, you think of the story and the mythology and the like core promise of San Francisco is that whoever you are, as whatever your lifestyle and how you express yourself, whatever persecution you've dealt with anywhere else in the country or the world, you can come to San Francisco, find a home, find a community, and be yourself. And when our prices are so high, it means a kid growing up queer in Alabama in an oppressive family or an oppressive community, they can't move to San Francisco. San Francisco can't be their safe haven. I know trans artists that, you're a gig away from homelessness, and then you find yourself on the streets, and all the danger and the vicious cycle and the difficulty of pulling yourself out of that can happen. It is like cruelly punishing to me people who are the most marginalized, the most vulnerable, and the most like needing and deserving of a home over their head and a community in which to thrive. But also when you create that scarcity, and when you have a zero-sum mindset or a negative-sum mindset, you start to pit people against each other. And when you pit people against each other, first of all, the powerful people still win and are more likely to win, and people who are more vulnerable are more likely to get hurt. And then you start to get situations where, there's lots of graffiti in San Francisco that I'll say like queers hate techies. And it just breaks my heart because I think it's so desperately important to create a world of abundance where everyone can thrive and have a role in the community and a place and a home to live in. And also, if there are people with wealth, that they can come to your community and then you can tax them and then you can spend that money on people who need a lift and a boost. And I think San Francisco has really deprived itself and created not just like scarcity and an oppressive housing situation, but a budget crunch in San Francisco's ability to take care of people that is created from a scarcity and a zero-sum mindset. You also brought up religion, which both makes me think of wanting to plug, Yes in God's Backyard, and the idea that churches and mosques and synagogues and folks who own that land can build housing as part of that religious center and solve the problem and also make their work and their charitable mission more sustainable and funded. And I wonder if we need to talk about the fact that we have a new pope, and he is from an American city. He's from Chicago. And he also thinks JD Vance is an idiot. And it's not lost on me that the Vatican decided to elevate a new American world leader who perhaps has more charitable, liberal, let's say, I would suggest more in the model of Jesus Christ and the teachings of the Bible approach to how we lift people up and take care of people. And I think that might be a direct rebuke of Trump and JD Vance and their scarcity and their cruelty and disregard for people. And the Pope's even on record and has tweets calling out JD Vance and mocking him. So I thought that was a really interesting turn of events. And I'm curious for any of your thoughts, both on in my little emotional monologue about how scarcity hurts people from all sorts of lifestyles and people who are marginalized and vulnerable, as well as Yes in God's Backyard, as well as our new first ever American Pope.
So I'll start with this, is that I've been working on this piece that I haven't just been able to fully crystallize, but I'll pitch it out here, which is that there really is this new politics of scarcity versus abundance, right? In that I've talked about this before, but JD Vance going to NLC and saying, yeah, we need to build more housing, but also we need to kick out 20 million new immigrants. That's not that different from the story you just shared of people in San Francisco who were there before, the tech industry grew, feeling a resentment towards the new techies who are coming, right? And I think in general, this scarcity mindset does cause you to hate the other person because you feel like you're competing with a limited resource for them instead of just building enough there's enough for both of you. And that connects to the Pope because the one thing that I don't know if you've seen this quote yet, but I thought it was really funny because I've been thinking about scarcity and abundance, and then the Pope just comes out and says it, which is but the problem with this hierarchy is that it feeds the myth that some people are more deserving of care than others. It's a framework that makes sense in a world governed by scarcity and fear, where protection comes at the expense of others. But Jesus never spoke of love as something to be rationed. He speaks of love as abundance, a table where there is enough for everyone. And I thought that was a wonderful message and something that really resonated with me and how I think about the world when I heard that. And in general, I think it's a positive moment that there's enough around for everyone and that we don't live in a world of scarcity where you have to pit neighbor against neighbor.
Pretty amazing. Got an abundance Pope. You also make me think of, I remember, call it a month ago, right? But essentially, as the, Ezra Klein, Derek Thompson's book made the rounds, I think there's a lot of conversation about is abundance a political winner? Is this what Democrats will campaign on? Can abundance win elections? And I think my attitude, and I think most of our movement's attitude was, well, that's not the point. Abundance is a policy framework. Political slogans and campaigns come later and fit the time and help you win, right? It's a different thing. I've, in the past week, kind of changed a little bit of my thinking on that. And this is why. It comes down to the tariffs and what's about to happen, right? When you talk about abundance and what you're talking about is housing or public transportation or energy, you're both talking about a crisis built up over more than 50 years, where we are the frog in the proverbial boiling water, right? You don't notice the crisis emerging. You are inured to it. It's just your normal. And we're also talking about housing that hasn't been built, energy that hasn't been built, public transportation that hasn't been built. How do you prove a counterfactual? How do you put that in people's heads? You cannot show this scenario that we'd love to show this alternative future, but it's not available for us to say, compare and contrast. But you know what we have abundance on today is stuff. We have an abundance of toys and an abundance of pencils and an abundance of dolls, to pick a few examples right out of Trump's mouths. And what's going to happen in a matter of weeks, the activity at the Port of LA is down 35%. Like, bad times are coming. And what's going to happen is shelves will go from abundant to empty. The things that are there and now more scarce will be significantly more expensive. And you will also notice that people who are rich, wealthy, privileged, well-connected, friends with Trump will still be able to get all the things they had before and everything they want. They will still live in abundance, but we will live in scarcity and the price increases that come with scarcity. And as opposed to the housing 50-year counterfactual, it's going to happen overnight, and we know what the alternative looks like. So we know what abundance looks like, and we're about to see what scarcity looks like. And I both think it will at that point be a little bit easier to say, hey, if you've noticed that now there's less toys and they're more expensive and rich people can still get them, now think about your rent and how that works, that will be an easier connection to make. But also that one of the main national conversations will be about Trump as an agent of scarcity. He doesn't even have a zero-sum mindset. He has a negative sum mindset. To me, I've said it before, I think he's the ultimate NIMBY in the sense of he's saying he has a ton of privilege. Also, America has a ton of privilege, but his strategy is not to build on that to grow into the future and in ways that everyone can win. His strategy is to try and consolidate that. And what happens then is you actually squander that great fortune and go backwards and destroy yourself. And possibly he doesn't care if we destroy ourselves a bit if other people destroy each other more. But I don't think a golden age is on the way. And so I kind of suspect that by the middle of the summer, there'll be a lot more conversations, if not necessarily about abundance, than about scarcity and what it looks like to go from having a lot of things and options to having less opportunity and a higher cost of living. And I'm curious what you think about that.
Well, one of the things I asked the Arizona trio about is, why did Democrats lose the trust of voters in the 24 election? And, why did Arizona vote for Trump? And, Councilmember Hernandez said that, we had really lost their trust on the ability to deliver results that are tangible on making things more affordable. And, she shared examples of how she's shown up for her community and fought for them, specifically on housing, on making housing more plentiful in a way that translated to real life results. I just think that's why this is such a golden moment for YIMBYism and for abundance broadly is, I think Democrats are waking up to the fact that, we lost the 24 election largely on affordability, but we have this opportunity to win back the trust of voters and an abundance mindset and an opportunity economy that works for everybody can really be the path forward.
You've been listening to Radio Abundance. Join the movement for progressive abundance at yimbydemocrats.org. Yes, we can build again. Yes, we can trounce the fascists. Yes, you can be the difference. This is AI, by the way. You think these jokers actually got Obama? Check in with me in a few months. It'll happen.
Thank you for listening to Radio Abundance, a new podcast by YIMBY Democrats for America. Now it's time for you to join the movement. We're building a big tent, and it's going to take all of us. Join us, and together we'll fight to build America, defeat fascism, and unleash the era of progressive abundance. Join the movement at yimbydemocrats.org.
The crisis over the lack of California's ability or desire to build enough housing has reached a really epic proportions in Los Angeles.
I give credit to these women immensely who came in and moved mountains on the housing front.
I'm going to double and triple down on the housing stances. In the YIMBY stance, we need more housing everywhere.
We dedicate more space for every car in California than we do for places for people to live.
The crisis has grown. down. A lot of people that might not have understood it or wanted to dip in it, it's like, well, now it's everywhere.
We have multiple spaces available at all times for every single of the millions of cars in California, but we don't have a place for everyone to live.
When we talk about the lack of housing options, I had direct experience with that because I had moved so often and I knew what it was like to only have large corporate-owned apartment complexes available and how that put so much of the power in the hands of the landlord.
We need community members, micro developers. They can actually build their own communities because they're heavily invested into that community to incorporate our culture and our arts.
It's all about living better, making things more affordable, being more sustainable.
I think there was too much listening to the polls when everywhere throughout my district, we were hearing affordability and housing and homelessness is their biggest priorities.
We stop projects that have the ability to save our planet.
Especially on the Democratic side, they need to see us out there. They need to see us delivering tangible wins that are going to ultimately change their material condition.
It's doable. We can do it. We have the vision. We've got the architects. We've got the will.
We have an amazing opportunity to do it here in Arizona, and hopefully that would be a model for others to tap into.
I love that you have a show centered around abundance, and it's something that I work on every single day.
Abundance is going to also be a path to equity for Black and Brown communities. It's going to be the work that's on the horizon for us.